Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $23 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine, Jan 5, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, Antonio Inoki retirement imminent. Full WCW Starrcade 1997 coverage. State of MMA, and more. By Observer staff. It is expected that Antonio Inoki will announce on January 4th that the final match of his 37-year pro wrestling career will be on April 4th at the Tokyo Dome. Inoki, who turns 55 on February 18th, would have to rank as probably the single biggest wrestling star of this generation. At his peak he was seen weekly in main events on primetime network television that drew top 10 ratings. He had the most famous worldwide pro wrestling match of the 70s in the absolute disaster that turned into a shoot match that nearly killed both he and pro wrestling in Japan in 1976 against Muhammad Ali. He headlined in front of the largest crowd in the history of pro wrestling, somewhere between 170,000 and 190,000 for a match with Ric Flair on April 29, 1995 in Pyongyang, North Korea at Mayday Stadium. He was the leader and driving force of New Japan Pro Wrestling during most of its 25-year run, which at many points in time was the most powerful wrestling organization in the world and had an early 80s box office peak which included selling out 90% of its house shows over a full calendar year period. Despite a less than stellar business reputation, he still parlayed his wrestling fame into winning a seat in the Japanese Senate, where he served from 1989 to 1995 before losing badly in a re-election after his political career became racked with the same controversial scandals that the business aspect of his pro wrestling career did. His reputation to the bigwigs in Japan in the wake of a scandal when his former secretary and a longtime business manager, former WWF figurehead President Hisashi Shinma, went public with allegations about manipulations, tax evasion and other serious breaches of public trust to the point that for a one-year period, TV Asahi, the network that broadcasted New Japan, refused to allow any Inoki matches on television despite him being the most famous, and thus the biggest ratings getter, of any wrestler in the country. Still, none of these seemed to adversely affect Inoki's popularity with the casual wrestling marks of Japan who grew up watching him on television vanquish superstars both from pro wrestling and from other sports every week. Although Inoki had a less than stellar reputation among the hardcores, the pop he received at the arenas put to shame anything nearly any wrestler in the world would receive on their best day. Inoki had been talking retirement for several years now, and had done a final countdown tour which had turned into almost something of a comedy act because of how long it had taken. Inoki himself over the past year when he'd made public appearances and New Japan shows causing a nearly hypnotic reaction among Japanese fans chanting his name, joked about his farewell tour being the longest of anyone in history. There had been reports over the past year that Inoki himself, who physically through the wonders of training, hair dye and plastic surgery, was able to avoid the ravages of aging that affect mere mortal men, was wanting to retire but since his name meant box office, that New Japan would look to him to make appearances to help sell tickets at the big dome shows. The timing of the final match and the expected announcement this week was probably to not take any of the steam and emotion away from the farewell of Inoki's longtime rival Riki Choshu, which is the main drawing item of the January 4th Tokyo Dome show, which has already sold out. It had apparently been somewhat of a closely guarded secret that Inoki's retirement would be on April 4th and that he would announce it publicly at the Dome show after the Choshu match so as not to steal any heat from Choshu, but it came out as front-page news in the Japanese media this week. There is no word over who Inoki's final opponent will be, although there is an unofficial fan poll over his final opponent with the top 10, in order, being Giant Baba, Tatsumi Fujinami, Rickson Gracie, Hulk Hogan, Shinya Hashimoto, Masahiro Chono, Akira Maeda, Evander Holyfield, and Naoya Ogawa. Of those, Baba, Gracie and Holyfield would be virtual impossibilities. Fujinami, his longtime understudy, would be the best bet for historical reasons, although if Hogan was willing to do the job, Inoki might take that for the ego gratification purposes, although Fujinami could deliver closer to what fans would like to see out of Inoki's farewell match. Hogan was Inoki's original first choice for the record-setting Korea match, but at the time Hogan, unlike Flair, was unwilling to do the job in the match. Inoki, a protege of Rikido's and the founder, lord and biggest star that will ever be in the Japanese wrestling universe, was recruited to be one of the new leaders of Japanese wrestling while still a teenager. Inoki, who was half Japanese and half Brazilian, lived in Brazil as a teenager and was a high school track star of such proportions that Rikido's heard about the large agile Japanese athlete and recruited him into pro wrestling. He started his career as Kanji Inoki. The Antonio name was hidden to keep from the public his Brazilian ancestry, making him not pure-blood Japanese and thus fearing it would keep from being fully accepted as a national superstar. and worked both in Japan and in the United States during the early part of his career. After Rikidozan's death and his return from the United States, Inoki worked his way up the promotional pecking order, finally settling at the number 3 position behind Shohei Giant Baba and Toyonobori for the Japanese Wrestling Alliance, JWA, in the mid-60s, a company headed by Junzo Hasegawa, who took over control after the 1963 stabbing gangland-style death of Rikidozan. JWA was the monopoly wrestling company in that country. Inoki's first out-of-the-ring headlines came when he, along with Toyonobori, Hiro Matsuda, Masa Saito and Moneyman Shinma formed the short-lived Tokyo Pro Wrestling Company, which lasted for about 1 year, built around Inoki as the leading star. When the group folded, Inoki returned to the JWA, but moved up to the number 2 position behind Baba in some ways, but in some ways the two were considered equals, particularly after Inoki and NWA World Champion Dory Funk Jr. wrestled 2 famous 60-minute draws in 1969 world title matches. In 1971, Baba and Inoki had their falling out, which actually started with them working together trying to take the promotion over from Hasegawa. When that attempt initially failed, Inoki was blamed as the culprit and fired late that year, while the promotion protected Baba, who at the time was considered the bigger star and draw. Inoki and Shinma got together and formed New Japan Pro Wrestling, with its first show on March 6, 1972. Inoki and Shinma were at the time an outlaw promotion in a worldwide wrestling environment controlled by the National Wrestling Alliance, which frowned upon opposition to its existing members, JWA being one of them, and blacklisted mainline talent from appearing. So with little in the way of mainstream foreigners aside from Karl Gotch, Karl Istaz, they started their company. Gotch, who was something of a legendary scientific star in Japan and had a reputation in many circles as being the top shooter of his era, but partially due to that was blacklisted out of most territories in the US since he had a reputation of being uncontrollable and uncooperative with promoters and also wasn't much of a drawing card in the US despite his actual ability. Inoki managed to build the promotion around himself and Gotch, and by the time of their second singles match on October 4, 1972 and a weekly time slot of TV Asahi, the promotion was on the map, drawing its first crowd of 10,000 fans. Inoki's dramatic battles for the times against the likes of Johnny Powers, Tiger Jeet Singh, Seiji Sakaguchi, Shozo Kobayashi and Kentaro Oki turned him into the most popular wrestler in the country. Despite rival All Japan, which Baba formed after leaving JWA, having connections to the top foreign talent through its NWA affiliation, New Japan was able, through Inoki's popularity and more daring and creative booking, to stay with them in a fierce weekly promotional war that was exceedingly bitter at times. With Inoki and Shinma having manipulated Inoki and pro wrestling into being a national sports hero, they took the next step in trying to manipulate to the Japanese public that pro wrestlers were actually the toughest fighters all around in the world. In what was decades before UFC, and totally worked, they started booking Inoki against martial arts superstars from other worlds. Inoki's rise to the pinnacle, never quite reached as being the number 1 sports idol in the country, started on February 6, 1976 when he defeated Wilhelm Ruska, who captured 2 gold medals in the 1972 Olympics in judo. This set up the Ali match, which was to make Inoki the ultimate fighter of his era before such a term had even been developed. The two had agreed to a finish where Inoki would be pounded on and bloodied up. Ali, showing sportsmanship, would pause, wanting the referee to stop the fight. While Ali paused, Inoki would rise from the dead and with his last ounce of energy, deliver his patented enzujiri, knocking Ali down for the pin. The nature of coming from behind and kicking him in the head while Ali was showing sportsmanship would be the face-saving for Ali in the United States, while in Japan Inoki's rising from the dead and winning the match would make him the country's biggest sports hero. Unfortunately, after Ali came to Japan for the fight, he changed his mind about doing the job. The match nearly fell apart as Inoki and Shinma had put the match together to make Inoki a hero, not for one payday, and have Ali win. Finally, in a negotiated settlement, the rules were changed to prevent Inoki from doing anything the Ali camp felt would be dangerous to his boxing career. Kicks to the head and throat were banned, as were suplexes, chokes, and Inoki couldn't punch to the face because he wasn't wearing gloves. The two were literally trying to work out a compromised finish until they were both out there, and the match was an actual shoot, with both afraid for their lives about losing and neither trying very hard at all to win. It went 15 rounds. It was terrible. It was ruled a draw. And it was over. Not just the match, but Inoki's career. In the biggest match of his life, he did something far worse than losing with honor. He didn't try to fight. New Japan's house show business and the wrestling business in Japan overall took a tumble. There were some who thought Inoki had screwed himself out of superstardom, being the scapegoat for the failed overthrow of the JWA in 1971, but it only set the stage for him becoming a bigger star in New Japan. There were many who thought at the time Inoki had killed his career with the Ali match. But through a series of worked victories, Shinma and Inoki were able to rebuild himself and pro wrestling to an even bigger level with wins over Ruska Alan Koaj, 1976 Olympic judo bronze medalist who later became a well-known wrestler Bad News Allen, Eddie Monsterman Everett, karate, Willie Williams, karate, and Mike Dayton, bodybuilding, combined with a promotional affiliation with Vince McMahon Sr. and the WWF, giving New Japan access to big-name foreigners including Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, and Dusty Rhodes. The next pinnacle was 1982, when House Show Business set records. That fell apart in 1983 when it became public knowledge that Inoki was embezzling New Japan profits and the wrestlers weren't getting paid what they were worth to fund money-guzzling business efforts abroad. It got so bad that New Japan lost much of its talent to All Japan, and the network nearly canceled pro wrestling, which would have been the death knell of the promotion. But like the failure of Ric Flair to jump to WWF in 1988 saved WCW, Flair's staying was a key element in Turner agreeing to buy the company, saving the old NWA from sure bankruptcy. Tatsumi Fujinami saved New Japan by failing to jump to All Japan when that became the thing to do. Inoki's next big gamble was booking the Tokyo Dome for a show in 1989 and becoming the first sports promoter to bring athletes from the old Soviet Union into professional sports, an accomplishment so noteworthy it was covered in both Sports Illustrated and the New York Times. Using several former amateur wrestling champions in mixed matches, the Japan vs. Russia show drew 53,800 fans, with Inoki putting over judo champion Shota Chakayashvili for his first ever loss in a mixed martial arts match and turned Salman Hashimukov into a short-lived pro wrestling superstar. Inoki going for revenge against Chakayashvili, and a three-way US vs. Japan vs. Soviet feud did some incredible box office for the remainder of the year before the gimmick of using the Soviets ran its course. During the late 80s, Inoki was one of the 10 highest-paid athletes in Japan according to annual newspaper stories, although his reported seven-figure annual income would have still ranked him behind Hulk Hogan in the US, and Inoki himself ran into frequent personal financial problems due to outside investments going sour. When Inoki's grip on the main event slot was loosening in 1989 due to advancing age, he maneuvered laterally, saying he was retiring from pro wrestling to run for the Senate and actually barely won a seat in power. In the Senate, when the stories of Inoki's improprieties came out, he was nearly impeached, but ended up suffering a crushing defeat in re-election in 1995 and started his Inoki Final Countdown Pro Wrestling Tour shortly thereafter. For nearly 16 months, Sting, one of the most popular wrestlers in the country over the past decade, was kept on the shelf with a new stoic brooding character taken from the Crow movie as an attempt for him to reach the franchise level of drawing card that had been long predicted for him and that he had never reached despite being thrust into that position numerous times. With carefully orchestrated theatrics and regular run-ins as time was running out on Monday nights, some segments of which were actually totally botched up, Sting had become the number 2 merchandise seller in the business behind Steve Austin. All this while never wrestling a match. At first, Sting was to make his triumphant return to the ring in February 1997 at the Cow Palace for Super Brawl, but the gimmick was working so well they decided to hold him out for almost all of 1997, climaxing with his winning the WCW title from Hulk Hogan at Starrcade. It was obvious the gimmick was paying off big. Anticipation for the match reached a level unseen in pro wrestling in this country in many years. The signing of the contract during a break-in on a Hogan movie on TNT drew one of the largest made-for-cable movie ratings in history. Nitro's numbers grew throughout the year, peaking to an unheard of 4.1 average during the final quarter of 1997 despite head-up competition from Monday Night Football, whose ratings declined 10% over the previous year this season. When tickets for the first pro wrestling show ever scheduled for December 28 at the MCI Arena in Washington, D.C. were put on sale 2 months earlier, WCW had already broken its all-time gate record. And the buy rate record was almost sure to follow. It would turn a great phrase to say that 16 months of work was exposed about halfway through Sting's walk down the aisle and before he ever got in the ring. The mythical superhero turned human right before the fans' very eyes. It wasn't as if it was a bad wrestling match that did it, although the match itself was bad. But you could see the big initial pop after all the hype and special effects didn't even last until Sting made it to the ring. The match itself was a struggle. The finish was totally botched up. Sting did leave as champion. But after WCW's most successful quarter in history, the record-breaking show raised more questions about the future than answers the record revenue will provide. And that was hardly the only question. Probably the most important question of all regarded Kevin Nash, scheduled to wrestle the Giant for the second straight pay-per-view show. The day before the show, WCW received word that Nash had suffered a mild heart attack at his home in Phoenix. Nash, who is 39, has a family history of heart problems, including his father dying of a heart attack before the age of 40. Nobody was exactly clear as to the actual story, as there were also reports it was thought to be a heart attack but actually a bad case of indigestion, which medically that mistake is not unusual to be made, causing massive chest pains, or massive chest pains from an anxiety attack suffered due to stress because his father-in-law has a serious health problem, which coincidentally enough is the exact same problem Undertaker had a few weeks ago, which caused his blood pressure and heartbeat to go through the roof and caused him to miss a house show, and the health problem is said to be the same life-threatening health problem that Undertaker's father is undergoing. The only thing anyone seemed to know for sure is that Nash was undergoing tests to see what kind of a problem it actually was. A man who legitimately has a bad heart is one hell of a risk, even with the style he works in the ring, yet there didn't seem to be nearly the concern one would expect from a lot of parties close to the situation if a superstar in the business was suffering a serious health problem that could keep him out of action for a long time. The reports were that Nash's father-in-law was in bad health with a life-threatening bowel problem, the same condition as Undertaker's father. Others were openly questioning it, believing that Nash had somehow found out the finish, and he was supposed to do the job, and everything else was a cover reason. Others speculated that even though there was probably some truth to some of the stories, it was a combination of both the former and the latter. It's really become a screwed up business when someone may have suffered a legitimate major health scare and his friend at the same time may have suffered a legitimate dislocated knee, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, but since they were friends and their group is building up a tremendous track record of excuses to avoid doing jobs, Helmsley was scheduled to drop the European title to Owen Hart at the Nassau Coliseum on December 29, but showed up injured from the show the previous day in Hamilton, Ontario, although at the same time Scott Hall has actually done a lot more jobs than he's given credit for. So many within the industry don't believe a thing anymore. It's a problem that ultimately was industry created. When promoters create an environment where the wrestlers themselves feel they are being manipulated and worked in doing angles specifically to fool the boys, breeds that problem even worse. It is only natural for the wrestlers themselves, once they get in a position of power, to try and play the game back. In an industry that needs some level of trust for a cohesive product, but never really has true trust because the business is built on a house of lies, even though the health of the industry is near peak levels, the foundation of the industry has never been so completely screwed up. Nash had managed to postpone his first pay-per-view match with the Giant, originally scheduled for World War III, claiming his knee hadn't recovered from arthroscopic surgery a few months back, and his entire ring time over the past several months consisted of the cameo at the end of the Battle Royal. He got out of numerous other booked house show matches with Giant. He did a few just before his injury, due to the knee surgery. But he had also told people that he wasn't going to work a program with the Giant, and in recent weeks before any of these problems surfaced had told people he wasn't doing the match at Starrcade for a variety of reasons, among them because he didn't think it had been promoted correctly and because he didn't want to do the program to begin with. And Nash wasn't the only problem on the show. Conan called and said that his girlfriend had given birth to a premature stillborn child and that he couldn't leave Mexico. This left a hole in the six-man tag match. The company wanted Randy Savage to fill the spot, and in negotiations to get him to fill the spot literally a few hours before the show was going on the air, had to agree to change the originally planned finish of the Steiners and Ray Traylor going over. To get Savage to agree, the finish was changed to where Savage got to score the pin using the elbow off the top on Scott Steiner. This left Scott Steiner visibly livid to the point he had major words with Booker Terry Taylor, and they tried to alleviate him by letting him do so many big moves at the end for saves before doing the job, although he still wasn't happy at all. Dean Malenko was originally mad because he had asked for Starrcade off because his wife was due at about that time. He was told if his wife was in labor or had given birth, that he didn't have to do the show and that Rey Mysterio Jr. would sub for him in the match against Eddie Guerrero. Apparently he was also unhappy about Guerrero versus Malenko being advertised on the television the previous weekend, when he believed the company had a good idea that he wasn't going to be there. Malenko's wife Julie gave birth to a girl on December 25th, and the plan was to put Mysterio Jr. against Guerrero in the match. However, with Conan and Nash both no-showing at basically the 11th hour and the company knowing basically all along that the advertised Raven vs. Chris Benoit match also wasn't going to take place due to Raven not being fully recovered from his inflamed pancreas, at that point they felt it important not to have another no-show and actually chartered a jet on the last day for Malenko to come in for the show. It is too early to get any kind of a realistic estimate on the buy rate. WCW sources were predicting ahead of time 500,000 buys, which would be about a 1.7, which would be the most buys for any pay-per-view show in this industry dating back to the heyday of the WWF on pay-per-view around 7 years ago. WCW's all-time record was probably around 310,000 buys for the Hogan-Piper Halloween Havoc cage match. Due to the holidays, even preliminary estimates are sketchy at best, but the early numbers are looking to be in the 1.55 range, which would be around 435,000 buys. The show destroyed WCW's all-time gate record, doing an even $543,000. As it turns out, the old record set for World War III on November 23 in Auburn Hills was actually $395,831 and not the $407,831 which was originally listed here, and also setting the company all-time one-night merchandise record at $161,961. The paid attendance for the sold-out show was a company record of 16,052, breaking the old mark of 16,025 set for the Nitro on June 9 in Boston. The total in the building was in the 17,500 range, falling slightly short of the company record of 18,003 set for the Nitro in Boston. On the broadcast, Tony Schiavone, using his best Monsonian figures, numerous times gave the attendance at 24,000. Even though it was the biggest WCW paid attendance in history, it was not even the biggest of the weekend in North American pro wrestling, as the WWF drew a sellout of 18,304, 16,620 paid for its December 26th house show at the Rosemont Horizon in suburban Chicago, headlined by Undertaker vs. Shawn Michaels, and they even had the match. The show was bad. Despite it being a full house, the crowd heat wasn't there. It appeared the people came only to see the main event, and they recognized quickly it wasn't what they had bargained for. Nearly every match on the show was worse than one would think it would be. Bischoff Zbyszko was the only one that would have been better, and that's only because how high could expectations have been going in, and only one or two of the matches looked good on paper to begin with. The main events were fiascos, particularly after all the hype. Of course, the title change itself got a big pop, but when does a world title change not get a big pop? And to WCW's credit, the one thing that did come off well was the post-match celebration, with the ring filling up with WCW wrestlers to celebrate Sting's win. The other big story was the finish. The story was scheduled to be that since Hogan was doing the job, he'd dominate on offense. Since Nick Patrick was going to turn heel as a ref, in a role that was originally designed for Earl Hebner. However, WCW either never made a strong enough effort to contact Dave and Earl Hebner, or they turned down the offer, but it's obvious that was what the original role in this match was booked for. He had to play it straight the entire match. After a lackluster match, which even saw boring chants 2 minutes in, Hogan delivered his foot to the face and leg drop finish. At this point, the plan was for Patrick to deliver a fast count and have Sting still kick out before 3, but Patrick would rule it as a pin, leading to Bret Hart's avenging the wrong done to him at Survivor Series and getting the match restarted and taking over as ref, leading to Sting winning with a scorpion submission in the middle. A funny thing happened. Patrick didn't count fast. Why is a bigger mystery than the weird gravitational pull from the alignment of the stars that resulted in Kevin Nash, Hoist Gracie and Hunter Hearst Helmsley all coming up injured within days of each other, just prior to all having to suffer either symbolic work or realistic beatings. You can mistime a ref bump. You can blow a move. But how do you blow a fast count? The only reasonable answer to this is Hogan changed the spot in the ring, and Patrick didn't want to cross Hogan because of all the power he wields, even though the plan was different. Coming off the Hart-Michaels deal, which has been the catalyst for everything in the business since, is Bischoff, Hogan and nobody else, perhaps Sting, decided to do a non-fast count when there was supposed to be a fast count. An angle. Is your head spinning yet? But that doesn't make sense either, because why did they have the announcers sell it as a fast count the next day so hard when it wasn't? And if that was the case, the guy who got screwed and made a fool of would have been Hart, who, if anything, this company wasn't trying to portray in that matter after the last company did. Sting did try to kick out, but Hogan didn't sell it by flying off, giving the first assumption some more validity. I'd say, coming in the wake of the Hart-Michaels deal, that the most likely scenario is that Hogan, who no doubt was negotiating for all he was worth as far as getting whatever he could out of doing the job, apparently was able to manipulate the finish into appearing that he actually won the match cleanly, and he was screwed by Hart, which wasn't the idea the fans were supposed to have. On TV the next night, they didn't even acknowledge the original story wasn't executed in the original manner, trying to sell the entire show that Patrick gave a fast count and Hart wouldn't stand for it. By all appearances, Hogan pinned Sting pretty much clean. He did hold the tights, but that's a normal heel finish. Hart then came out and prevented the ref from ringing the bell, punched out Patrick, who told Hart he had counted 3, trying to say he'd never let a ref screw a wrestler like that, playing off the Survivor Series finish. Amazing how one finish can be the backbone of the top angles in 2 promotions at the same time, and got into the ring to take over as referee. As both Marcus Bagwell and Scott Norton failed in run-ins, teased by having a similar run-in finish cost Lex Luger his match with Bagwell, Sting clamped on the Scorpion after signaling that the hold was almost a tribute to Hart by the eye contact made, and Hart ruled it was a submission and called for the bell. With the finish from the previous night messed up and thus really unable to ever be shown on television, basically it's okay to have the fans spend $28 to buy the replay to see a fast count that isn't, but never to see it for free. It was decided after the dust settled to change directions once again. A match was held on Nitro the next night in Baltimore, with the gimmick being that the finish wouldn't be shown on television, and likely used as a tease for the debut of the Thursday show, and they'd basically do the same finish with a few minor ramifications. So on Nitro the next night, they hyped a Sting-Hogan title rematch for the main event. About 6 minutes into the match, at about 10:04 p.m., just as ref Randy Anderson was bumped after being in the wrong place when Sting did the Stinger Splash, the show abruptly went off the air. Naturally, there were more complaints about this the next day at Turner Broadcasting than anything WCW has ever pulled in its history, although that reaction was by design and not unexpected. Nitro had set a precedent for the last 18 months at least of staying with the main event until the finish, broken once before as a way to garner ratings for the debut of the Robin Hood series by pretending Hogan and the Giant were doing a 40-minute match and showing taped clips purported as being live as the show was on the air. This actually would have been the earliest the show had gone off the air in recent memory, despite having nothing but the Nitro replay to follow on TNT and it being billed as the biggest match in Nitro history. After the show went off the air, with Anderson down, Nick Patrick did a run-in as referee. Hogan again hit the leg drop, and this time Patrick did the planned fast count, the clip that will be used forevermore, and just as he was hitting 3 for the super fast count this time, Sting kicked out, although it was basically a dead heat as to which happened first. Sting got up and clotheslines Patrick. The match continued with Sting getting Hogan in the Scorpion and Anderson reviving and calling for the bell. It should be noted that both nights when Hogan submitted to the Scorpion, in neither instance did he tap out. J.J. Dillon grabs the belt and goes to give it to Sting, but at this point Bischoff and Dillon end up in a tug-of-war over the belt, ending when Bischoff KOs Dillon with a kick. Sting then drops Bischoff using the reverse DDT to the biggest pop of the night. As the NWO guys go for the run-in on Sting, they're cut off by the WCW guys, with the biggest reaction coming again to Hart fighting with Hall, but also out there were Lex Luger, Diamond Dallas Page, Ray Traylor, the Giant, the Steiners, Jim Duggan, and others. What I expect to happen from this is that they'll talk about the controversial ending on the weekend television and also on Nitro, and tease that the clip will air on the first Thursday show on January 8th. At that point they'll announce the title is held up and set up a rematch either for the sold-out pay-per-view on January 24th or Super Brawl at the Cow Palace on February 22nd, with it more likely being at the latter, and whatever finish likely setting up a Hogan-Bret Hart match. At this point the only matches official for Sold Out are Luger vs. Savage and Zbyszko vs. Hall, and I'd guess Ultimo Dragon defending the Cruiserweight title against Eddie Guerrero. In the much-hyped match for Nitro, WCW President Bischoff had his first pro wrestling match at the age of 41. Going into the match with what was said to have been a serious knee injury, perhaps a broken kneecap suffered in training for the match that may require surgery, although he was not limping on television the next night, Bischoff did reasonably well for his first match. However, it was nothing close to reasonably well for the semi-main event on the biggest show in company history. Even with 44-year-old announcer Larry Zbyszko somewhat smaller than in his active days, and maybe in little better shape, he was so much larger than Bischoff that his attempts to sell Bischoff's weak appearing offense turned the match from a heat-seeking missile into an almost ridiculous farce within 2 minutes. To make things worse, on a night where so much went wrong, in the finish, where Bischoff was supposed to kick Zbyszko in the head in a loaded kick pad with Scott Hall putting an object in the pad, the object went flying out of Bischoff's kick pad into the air just before the kick made contact with Zbyszko's head. Zbyszko had to sell that blow as a knockoff, and Hart, who had teased a heel turn as ref throughout the match, suddenly shocked everyone by punching out Bischoff, as he did McMahon, when Bischoff offered him the huge money, thus, I guess, showing publicly that he wasn't a sellout. The announcers never explain what the storylines are, since everything is dual storyline nowadays, so who knows what the real idea behind that was. Hall did a run-in but was quickly put in the Scorpion by Hart, which actually got the biggest pop of the show up to that point. Zbyszko then choked Bischoff with his black belt, and Hart got off a laid-out Hall, and raised Zbyszko's hand signifying that WCW retained Nitro. As for the big question about Thursday, well, if you got any good ideas for a Thursday night show, mail them to Eric quickly because they're starting on January 8th. And if you've heard any rumors of the concept, they're only rumors because everything right now is up in the air. 1. Eddie Guerrero retained the Cruiserweight title pinning Dean Simon, in 1457. This was the best match on the show, but well below the standard that you'd expect from these two. They worked a slower pace early. The match lacked heat, although that was true for basically the entire show. At about the 10 minutes mark, Guerrero began working over Malenko's knees, including one spot where he put Malenko's knees in between the ring steps and the ring post and dropkicked the steps into the knee. Guerrero did several dropkicks to the knee. It was solid Japan-style work, but it was a crowd that seemed to be more into the spectacular. Malenko did a great wheelbarrow German suplex, but when he gave Guerrero a backbreaker, he sold it as if it made his knee worse. The match was flat, even building toward the finish, even though technically it was a real good match. With Malenko never making any sustained comeback, Guerrero came off the top rope with a dropkick to the knee, and finished with a frog splash landing on the knees. This match wasn't even close to the same level as Guerrero's match on WCW Saturday Night against Mysterio Jr. or Malenko's match on the same show against La Parka. 2 3/4 stars. Scott Hall came out and did the survey interview and then said that Kevin Nash, who has shrunk back down to 6'10" according to Hall this week, wouldn't be there. Hall gave no explanation at all. Earlier in the show, the announcer said that Nash wouldn't be on the show but also gave no explanation. Hall made fun of the Giant, who came out sans cast on his hand. Hall attacked Giant, who made a quick comeback with a press slam and teased doing his choke slam, but instead dropped Hall using a Nash-style jackknife powerbomb. For whatever reason, Giant came out and looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Pre-game show tangent time. On the pre-game show, Bobby Heenan and Tony Schiavone were running the show down. This was probably taped a few weeks ago, although in the commentary they made it seem like they were doing it live across the street from the building and getting ready to do the big show. It was clearly taped before the angle was shot where Heenan turned NWO for a week. Heenan was cheerleading for WCW, running down the NWO, etc. He was also talking about doing commentary on the show. From what we understand, the plans were for Schiavone, Heenan and Dusty Rhodes to do the show. How Dusty got back on the team is one of life's great mysteries, and I guess just shows in wrestling it pays to be really incompetent at your job. Heenan went to Bischoff the day of the show and asked how it should be handled with him doing the show and his NWO turn, and Bischoff decided it didn't make storyline sense and he was pulled from the show. The pregame show was one of those storyline snafus that are becoming more prevalent with weekly booking changes and things also taped far in advance. But the point of the pregame show, more important than the humor value of seeing Heenan's act and seeing firsthand to the world how disorganized WCW is despite its success, was the handling of the Nash Giant situation. That match was heavily pushed on the pregame show despite word being out that it wasn't going to take place. There is no excuse at all for WCW not placing a crawl on the screen saying that for whatever excuse, and I guess no excuse since none was ever given, that the Nash Giant match wasn't going to take place. Realistically, even though it would create a difficult situation because WCW wants mainly clean finishes, and with Hall scheduled to get a title shot in February, he really shouldn't job now, but Hall should have replaced Nash and done a singles match with the Giant rather than just doing a jackknife angle. Not that it would have made the show better. Actually, it might have made it worse. 2. Randy Savage, Randy Poffo, and Vincent, Michael Jones, and Scott Norton beat the Steiner brothers, Robert and Scott Reach Steiner, and Ray Traylor in 11:06. Match was unusually bad. Rick Steiner, who has worked for years with Norton, was having trouble doing his power moves due to Norton's weight. As far as getting Scott to do the job, he got to do his sky-high DDT on Vincent, but Norton made the save. He then did a Frankensteiner off the top rope on Vincent and Savage made the save. He went to the top again, but Norton caught him and had him on his shoulders and dropped back with him. This laid him out for Savage to drop the elbow for the pin. 1/2 of 1 star. J.J. Dillon came out and said they put all the refs' names in a lottery and Nick Patricks was picked out to referee the main event. They spent the rest of the show remembering back to Patrick's NWO days. 3. Bill Goldberg pinned Steve McMichael in 5:59. They started brawling in the aisle. Unfortunately, they wound up in the ring. There was no heat at all because it was the deaf, dumb and blind leading the blind. It ended up with a spot where Goldberg punched McMichael, who fell through a table set up at ringside. There was a small ECW chant. Not sure if it was in mocking it, actually it should have been, but it wasn't, since it was the weakest table-breaking spot in history. McMichael got back in the ring selling his back. He tried his tombstone piledriver, but couldn't hold Goldberg, who then finished McMichael with a jackhammer, suplex slam. Hideous. -1 star. 4. Perry Satolo beat Chris Benoit in 10:50 after oodles of outside interference in a no DQ match. Raven got on the mic before the match and said that his contract states he can pick when he wrestles, who he wrestles and where he wrestles, and that he wasn't wrestling. This gimmick is okay for free TV, But after you pay $28 for a pay-per-view and Nash no-shows with no reason given and basically explained by Hall as if he just didn't feel like coming, and then Conan isn't there with no reason, not that Savage wasn't a far bigger star in exchange given, and then you've got this guy who actually is there as just says he doesn't feel like wrestling. What does it say to the guy who bought the pay-per-view? Match was fast-paced with Benoit's offense looking great. There were more mistimed spots in the first 5 minutes of this match than in probably all of Benoit's matches in the first 51 weeks of 1997 combined. It ended up being saved by constant interference from the nest, and Saturn did a few great moves. He did a nice walk-up moonsault. There was a fight in the stands that distracted the audience from the match. Benoit put on the crossface on the floor when the entire nest jumped him and held him for Saturn trying a springboard reverse crossbody, but Benoit moved and Saturn fell short of being caught by the flock and landed on his knees, which couldn't have been a picnic. He got up and seemed okay. Benoit delivered an incredible headbutt off the top, which was the move of the show. At this point, Raven and the entire flock ran in again. Benoit destroyed Sick Boy, Lodi and Kidman and then was face-to-face with Raven. Before Benoit could nail him, Hammer clocked Benoit from behind and Raven gave him a DDT. Saturn then used the rings of Saturn for the submission. 1.5 star. 5. Marcus Bagwell pinned Lex Luger, Larry Fole, in 1636. This feud is elevating Bagwell's career as he continually takes credit for beating Luger on flukes, but it also shows Bagwell's limitations as a worker as he can't even come close to carrying Luger to a decent match. Way too long and boring. At one point Bagwell called for Vincent to come out. Vincent did some interfering. Finally Luger made the comeback, but it wound up with Bagwell knocking Luger into ref Billy Silverman, who took a bump. Luger racked Bagwell, but no ref. Savage did a run-in but Luger racked him, but again no ref. Norton did a run-in and clocked Luger with a dog collar, which the announcers intimated was stolen from Rick Steiner, put Bagwell on top and helped the ref up, who counted to 3. 1/2 star. 6. Diamond Dallas Page Falkenberg, beat Kurt Hennig in 10:52 to win the U.S. title. Both worked hard, but the crowd wasn't into it and the match was only okay. They traded near falls with no heat or intensity. It was like Page was trying to put together a good match and Hennig was going through Page's motions. Page did a few nice reversals off Hennig's attempts at his winning fisherman suplex before finally hitting the diamond cutter for the clean win. 2 stars. 7. Larry Whistler beat Eric Bischoff in 11-12 to earn a match with Scott Hall on January 24th and retain Nitro with Bret Hart as referee. Funny story about this one. The magazine On Sat, which is a satellite magazine, in a story that was delivered to subscribers on December 23rd and December 24th, had a story about the new NWO Thursday Thunder show, which basically gave away the finish of this match. Not that anyone shouldn't have figured it out once Hart was named ref. The story also reported that the recent Starrcade was the biggest revenue pay-per-view event in company history, which it probably will be, but since the event hadn't taken place yet and there's no such thing as reliable advances on pay-per-view buys, is something that nobody even knows today, let alone before the show took place. Anyway, Zbyszko did about as well as he could given Bischoff's lack of experience and the size difference, but it must have hurt to sell that offense. Funny thing is that after the match, everyone was praising Bischoff for the great job he did in the match. I mean, it was great for a 41-year-old guy who had never had a pro match before, but the match didn't get anywhere near the heat it should have, and it seemed the air was going out of the crowd the longer they were out there. I guess that's the wrestling business. Mainly Bischoff beat on Zbyszko with punches and kicks. When Zbyszko got Bischoff in a sleeper and a head scissors, Hart ruled both as chokes to tease the idea he was turning heel, but wouldn't admonish Bischoff for not breaking on the ropes. Bischoff did miss a spot where he was supposed to go into the post and froze while Zbyszko was going for a leg lock, but Zbyszko reacted pretty quickly to change it to the standing figure 4. Bischoff did a good job selling that he was blown up Zbyszko doing the rope a dope. Zbyszko came back and Bischoff even took a vertical suplex. Hall then put the object in Bischoff's boot and he did the KO kick, leading to the finish. It appeared that Bischoff never submitted from the choke using his black belt, and Hart just raised Zbyszko's hand as a reverse decision, although nothing was actually made clear by the announcers other than Zbyszko winning. 1/4 star. 8. Sting, Steve Borden, won the WCW title for the 4th time, beating Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, in 12:54. Sting, in a sleeveless outfit, looked really small compared to the past. Hogan looked lighter than usual as well. Not much of a match. Sting threw a few dropkicks but mainly Hogan dominated. Hogan's selling was pathetic. Sting did a no-sell spot on a suplex and then pointed to his crotch a la DX, or NWO. So much for product differentiation. Hogan then used Sting's bat on him. Sting reversed a whip and Hogan took the weakest guardrail bump in recorded wrestling history. Sting then took a better guardrail bump, crashing onto it when Hogan moved and he tried a Stinger splash. Hogan crotched Sting on the rail and gave him a reverse atomic drop. The Hogan version was a hell of a lot better than the version Luger did earlier in the show with Bagwell that had about a foot of light. Then came the foot to the face and leg drop, without the fast count, for the 3. Hart came out and stopped the ref from ringing the bell and threw Hogan back in the ring and took over as ref. Bagwell and Norton tried run-ins while about 50 WCW wrestlers ringside just watched. Sting knocked them both out of the ring and glanced at Hart, then put Hogan in the Scorpion, and Hart signaled that Hogan had submitted. All the WCW wrestlers that were at ringside the entire show then hit the ring for a great post-match celebration. 1/4 star. The world of NHB went through its own series of twists and turns over the past week due to an injury to Hoist Gracie, canceling what had been perhaps the most anticipated fight in a long time against Mark Kerr and ending with the entire show postponed. KRS announced the matchup of undefeated fighters for the main event on January 18th at the Yokohama Arena on the Pride 2 show a few weeks ago. At that point there was a cloud hovering over the match in the form of Kerr's contract with Semaphore Entertainment Group, UFC, which prohibited him from fighting on a televised show. The show would be televised in Japan, and on a show 30 days before or after a UFC show. This was 28 days after the UFC show that Semaphore Entertainment Group attempted to book Kerr on. However, due to the legal problems with Semaphore Entertainment Group, Kerr wouldn't do the show. The judge in New York refused to issue a restraining order to prohibit Kerr from doing the show. We don't have a lot of details on the court case other than the ruling seemed to be it was a matter for civil courts to decide on the validity of the contract, which there is some question of since the contract was issued in New York and Ultimate Fighting is actually an illegal activity in the state, so therefore it may put into question every existing UFC contract on those grounds. Just a few days later, and if you're picking up a pattern in this issue, it's because there is a pattern. Hoist Gracie allegedly suffered a back injury which resulted in a bulging disc, leading to numbness in his right arm and right leg, and will be out of action from 4 to 8 months, thereby canceling the fight. A few days later, with no main event, KRS announced the January 18th show was being moved to March 15th. Coming on the heels of the fiasco involving the Ken Shamrock negotiations, the subpar Japanese show leading to a lot of people questioning the credibility of parts of the event and the cancellation of what was the most intriguing big-name fight in a long time have left the NHB industry in apparent disarray. Everything from the rules, the credibility, the methods of promotion and the matchmaking have all been called into question over the past week. The fact that everyone promoting Vale Tudo has a different set of rules. Some matches are in a boxing ring, which is the wrong setting because fighters can use the ropes for balance and to avoid takedowns, or risk injuries from falling out of the ring. But the cage, like the former issue over the lack of gloves, is a weird political issue based on ignorance. While the more violent appearing, but scripted, ECW is making headway in getting reversals by cable companies largely because WWF is becoming more violent and it's difficult to exclude ECW from pay-per-view over content and allow WWF, and WWF is a big moneymaker. There is still no sign of a cable company reversing its position on this subject. Even though the buy rate of the recent UFC shows is somewhere between double and triple that of ECW, few would argue that for 1998, ECW's future as a pay-per-view entity looks brighter. Ref John McCarthy blew the call in the Kazushi Sakuraba vs. Conan Silveira original match, although at the time he appeared adamant about his decision to stop the fight and he had a better view of Sakuraba's eyes than any television camera. The decision to put them back in the ring for a rematch came off on pay-per-view is the right decision. But many are questioning that it happened more because the Japanese protested so loudly and longly and it was a political compromise, and one wonders if under other circumstances, and had it been an American or Brazilian fighter that McCarthy had ruled couldn't continue and had there been no nationalistic protest, would the same situation have occurred? There is another question regarding the tournament. While alternate fight winner Trey Telligman went into the show injured and came out of a tough match with Brad Kohler limping, he was ready and willing to continue on. When Tank Abbott suffered a hand injury and couldn't go into the finals, by UFC rules that put Telligman into the finals. Theoretically, the Sakuraba vs. Silveira match was a first-round match and there still should have been a Sakuraba vs. Telligman tournament final. It was said at the show that Telligman couldn't continue due to an injury, but those close to Telligman claimed that while he was hurt, nobody examined him and ruled his injuries were too severe to continue, and he didn't indicate to anyone he wasn't willing to continue, so the entire tournament protocol was thrown out the window. More than any other show, this card seemed like something where rules were changed on the spot. McCarthy clearly had the authority to stop the fight. No ref is perfect, and McCarthy for the most part has been an excellent, although some would say a little too aggressive at times, official. He admitted a blown call in ruling that Maurice Smith kicked Mark Coleman when he was down when Coleman actually wasn't down. As it turned out, the right thing appeared to happen, but some would argue it was for all the wrong reasons. It has been clearly stated that judges in UFC fights can't rule a draw. In the Severn Shamrock title match in Detroit, where neither really deserved to win, if judges were allowed to rule it a draw, they very well may have. The obvious conflict of interest in making John Peretti a judge to begin with when he had just taken the job as matchmaker, and everyone knows for business that Maurice Smith makes a better champion than Randy Couture, was already a problem. But judging the match a draw was against what we believed UFC rules actually were. Judging problems themselves are unavoidable, and we've seen far more smelly decisions in boxing than UFC. In fact, I can't even say we've seen one bad decision in the history of UFC fights that had gone the time limit. But now comes the most serious problem, and that is the connection to the world of pro wrestling. Many of the best fighters in UFC history, Ken Shamrock, Dan Severn, and Maurice Smith, all came from a background which included other sports but also participation in worked pro wrestling matches. It's a weird problem. Every one of these men proved they belonged as UFC stars by what they did in legitimate matches, so to exclude people with backgrounds in works wouldn't be fair. UFC has spawned now a number of people who have dabbled in pro wrestling, and a few who have become legitimate stars, Shamrock and Don Frye as the best examples, based largely on their success in UFC. On last week's show, the roster and ties to pro wrestling make it really weird. Of the 12 fighters on the show, 5 had participated in pro wrestling in the past: Tillman, Yoji Anjo, Kazushi Sakuraba, Frank Shamrock and Smith, and another probably will shortly, Tank Abbott. Anjo, Sakuraba and Smith have done worked pro wrestling matches. Tillman has only done one match with Pancrase that I'd assume was a shoot, and I don't even want to comment on what Frank Shamrock has or hasn't done because it is largely shooting in Pancrase, but not always, and he's done a lot of matches there, and anything I were to say about the subject would be pure speculation on either account. Joe Charles did a questionable Vale Tudo match in Japan prior to this one. One could argue that in the previous generation, there were many great athletes who went from the Harlem Globetrotters, who did worked pro basketball, to the NBA, which was a shoot, and nobody questioned their NBA performances. So this is a confusing issue. But the Charles Vitor Belfort match opened a major can of worms. But the biggest problem is what befell the world of kickboxing when it was starting to make headway in the United States in the early 80s. Numerous organizations spring up, all crowning world champions, none of which have any credibility and, more importantly, drawing power to the public. The top fighters, once they make a reputation, are often unwilling to test that reputation against fighters they feel are a risk to that reputation. With the media not taking the sport seriously because it's not something they grew up with, combined with politicos either in the pocket of boxing or not understanding the sport putting restrictions on it, then result in killing its growth. In NHB, so many of the top fighters seem unwilling to face other top fighters. And then you have the Tom Erickson problem. There are many NHB competitors, particularly amateur wrestlers, who believe Erickson is as close to unbeatable as anyone in NHB, acknowledging that should he make a mistake, anyone can be submitted but nobody could overpower him. UFC itself is loaded down with amateur wrestlers, and the belief is Erickson is not particularly charismatic or flashy, or easily beatable. At this point, UFC has to be both sport and entertainment, and neither of those words are bad words, despite the fact purists decry the word entertainment attached to sports, and it is acknowledged that UFC can exist only for the purist or it'll die a fast death. So you have the entertainment decision and not use Erickson. But how do you justify it from a sports perspective when so many of the athletes involved think he's the closest thing to unbeatable? And the wrestlers themselves pose a problem. They aren't willing to fight each other. So why introduce new wrestlers when the mix at the top is already clogged up with wrestlers? If Erickson comes in and dominates, what do? Couture won't fight him. And it's not just the wrestlers. For the most part, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys won't fight each other either. So how this all sorts out between the problems with the fighters and the problems with the cable companies and politicians and the lack of uniform application of the few rules is the story for 1998. Final 1997 match quality ratings. While recognizing the limitations of a system where wrestlers and teams are ranked based on the average rating of their major show matches during the previous year, quality of opponents isn't taken into consideration. Restraints based on promotional decision of time allotment and limitations and changes thrown in at the last minute, and the subjectivity of rating matches to begin with. There is a lot that can be learned from these numbers. These numbers are a better indication of consistency throughout the year than memories of only the best or worst that survived the year. They also tell stories of whose work truly improved and dropped off, as opposed to people swayed by illusory improvement of someone getting a bigger push or more television time. And they do tell just how pathetic 1997 was when it came to tag team wrestling in the United States, although I'm sure most realize you didn't need to see numbers to figure that out. In running down notes on the various people, here are more items to be considered. Steve Austin was actually at a 3.94 clip before suffering the neck injury in the SummerSlam match with Owen Hart. Had he not suffered the injury, he'd have been in contention and possibly even been the most consistently productive performing wrestler in the United States for the year. Although Marcus Bagwell received tons of support and will finish strongly in the most improved wrestler category, that is more due to his heel role garnering him more of a television push and an improvement in persona based on being given a chance. It has nothing to do with actually having better matches. Chris Benoit may very well be the single best junior heavyweight worker in the business and best overall worker in the United States, but he was buried with weak opponents and feuds all year long. While a drop of .79 in most cases would be a significant decline, upon closer look at his opponents, this is one case where the numbers have to be disregarded. On the other hand, the decline in the work of Masahiro Chono is significant for a wrestler that is arguably the most important wrestler in arguably the most successful company in the world. Chono is another whose reputation as a worker exceeds his actual work, and where these numbers actually do tell a story, as they do for the actual level of worker Ric Flair was in 1997. Although we haven't heard it much over the past year, Dustin Runnels, Goldust, always had a reputation for being a good, although not great worker. It was a rep garnered many years ago in WCW, but he's only shown limited spurts of that rep since joining the WWF. For 2 years now he's actually been a below-average worker in the ring. Eddie Guerrero going into Starrcade was actually the top-rated North American worker for 1997, but the subpar, by his standards, not for others, match on that card nudged him into 4th place behind Psychosis, Ultimo Dragon, and Bret Hart. For all the talk of Hart slipping, he actually had better big show matches in 1997 than he did in 1996. Quite frankly, more likely than not, had the Michaels match went to its fruition with the added 4 more minutes of near falls, it almost surely would have been better than a 4 stars match, and Hart would have been the top-rated North American wrestler of the year. This isn't to make any statements about his drawing power or whether he was worth what his contract says or if he's a better choice to be on top than Shawn Michaels, only that when it came to the big shows, in the ring, Hart is still at the top of not only his game but of the game. Despite having one of the best heads of hair in the business, when it comes to production in the ring, Hunter Hearst Helmsley was overall an average wrestler in 1996 and an average wrestler in 1997. He had an improved push during the year and was positioned as a superstar, but overall his work nor his ability to get over gave no backing to the new push. He's doing well in his new role, but getting that role had more to do with who was one of Shawn Michaels' few friends in the company and his look, and throughout the years there are numerous people in the business who have made tons of money based on their look with no ability in the ring. The fact that Shinya Hashimoto's decline was fairly small over the last year is actually amazing. There is not one major star in the business, not Benoit, not anyone, who was put in the ring in major singles matches with such a poor quality of opponents and to pull some actual good matches out of the likes of Naoya Ogawa twice, and nobody else has come close to have matches with Ogawa at that level, and even bad matches out of Zane Frazier and Hubert Numrich and still keep a 2.73 average for the year shows Hashimoto to really be one of the best in the business. If anyone was still judging Kurt Hennig as a wrestler based on the fact he was top 5 in the world in his prime, check out the numbers, and if you figure in that his bouts have been against Page and Flair, both of whom even at this stage can't be considered below average on their own, you'll see his actual nickname at this stage of the game is either Mr. Slightly Below Average or the $750,000 Lemon. Jeff Jarrett declined, but there isn't a guy who wouldn't having to work a program with Steve McMichael. Chris Jericho must be one of the most underrated workers in the business. I'm amazed Ahmed Johnson was fared as well as he has the past 2 years. It takes a long time to accept people at the level they are. I've noticed in awards when it comes to bests and worsts and improvement that often there is what I'd call a 1-year latency period, in that people don't notice improvements and declines in talent until sometimes a year after it takes place. Case in point, Koji Kanemoto. Based on the full year, there was not a better worker in the business. But since Kanemoto was always considered a top 20 level guy, most would tab his improvement this year to maybe cracking the top 10, when he not only cracked the top 10, but plowed through it. On the other hand, we have Toshiaki Kawada. There are a lot of people, myself included, who immediately would rank Mitsuharu Misawa, Kenta Kobashi and Kawada as the three best heavyweight wrestlers in the world. As you can see, both Misawa and Kobashi unquestionably deserve that reputation. Kawada, for 2 years running, has finished number 13 and number 15, despite having numerous Match of the Year type efforts. Fact is, Kawada, unlike Misawa and Kobashi, sometimes has real bad nights on real big shows. No doubt when Kawada turns it on, he's equal to anyone in this business, but what these numbers show is that both of the last 2 years his consistency hasn't been enough to crack the top 10 even if his best matches are. I guess whatever rep Kenta Kobashi has garnered is deserved. Finishing number 1 2 straight years says a lot. Sure, it helps when you get 3 major singles matches with Misawa, so he's been positioned where he should do well. But positioning alone isn't going to make someone number 1 2 straight. And if we'd done these numbers before, I'd guess Kobashi would be at or near the top for many years before that. For Jushin Liger to have a year like he did coming back from a brain tumor which at first thought could be a career ender is probably the single most underpublicized story of 1997. Liger has been so good for so long that his work is taken for granted. In the ring, he is for consistency the greatest junior heavyweight of all time. There are others, like Benoit, who are in his class, but on a nightly basis going back for the last 9 years, he may be the best worker in the business. Dean Malenko is consistently very good. What a revelation. Shawn Michaels is, well, you can see the numbers. You can argue Shawn versus Brett till the cows come home and it really doesn't matter. Shawn didn't get a good match out of Sid despite being in his home city before 60,000 fans, but Brett probably couldn't either. Brett got a better match out of Del Wilkes than Shawn did out of Ken Shamrock. From most accounts, Brett's house show matches when Shamrock were better than Shawn's television and pay-per-view matches with Shamrock, although Shamrock should be a better opponent for Brett since Brett had a hand in training him. Brett's England pay-per-view match with Undertaker and Shawn's first pay-per-view match with Undertaker were of similar quality, although Michaels' cage match with Undertaker was one of the best performances by anyone all year. Michaels is a great worker, but on a consistent basis he's also not the best in the business. Misawa's numbers aren't a surprise. Actually, if you throw in tag team matches, he was better than Kobashi or Kanemoto. Kobashi did have one horrendous match on a big show, a tag match with he and Johnny Ace versus Steve Williams and Gary Albright, this year, while Misawa's worst matches were still 3.25 stars, and that's with 15 major show singles and tag matches, and not all against Kobashi and Kawada more than any wrestler in the business during the year, 11 of which were 4 stars or better. Mysterio Jr.'s decline can be summed up in 2 words: Prince Iaukea, whose illusory better than average rating can be summed up by Rey Mysterio Jr. Take the Prince matches out and you've got a 3.85 rating, which again would be the tops in North America for the year. In 1996, Mysterio Jr. had the most consistent great matches in North America because he was largely booked against his best possible opponents on big shows: Ultimo Dragon, Juventud Guerrera, Psicosis, Dean Malenko and Jushin Liger, among others. This year he had Iaukea and Kanen. The numbers tell the story about Keiji Muto in 1997. He's gone from being one of the best workers in the business to probably the most inconsistent, although even in the past he was inconsistent. He can still be a great worker when he's got the working shoes on. But he laced those boots up a whole lot less this year than last year. He's probably the equivalent in Japan to Randy Savage in his prime, where he is a great worker, but he often sucks. Savage's work plunged for years to where everyone wrote him off as being washed up. But as this year shows, he still has a lot left in him. Muto shows enough flashes to see he's got a lot of great matches left in him, but he was sure inconsistent this year. And when he doesn't have his lucky boots on, his matches smell like we cold fish. Shinjiro Otani is one of the best. What a shock, huh? Diamond Dallas Page is the most improved wrestler in the business. Talk about the illusion based on positioning. In 1996, he had to work with guys like Booty Man, so he deserved some slack. This year his big matches were against the likes of a revitalized Randy Savage, a good friend in Marcus Bagwell, and a guy with a great rep, although living off it, in Kurt Hennig, and he did no better. Page has a lot of charisma. His timing of when to do moves can be great, and he did an incredible job of getting his finisher over. His interviews can be great. His major stardom is this business is because Hall and Nash sold for him and Sting and just about nobody else, because he was given ample TV and because positioning is almost everything. But is he one of the best workers in the business? His talk and push are so good that a lot of people believe it, and hey, that's what this business is all about. Except he's not. Amazing that there wasn't a North American worker in the business that was more consistent in big show matches than a WCW TV jobber. Psicosis? Is he and El Samurai the single most underrated workers in the business today? Savage's numbers seem to be an accurate indication that for whatever reason he's probably wrestling the best he has in many years. Tatsuhiro Takaiwa is the most improved wrestler in the business. Going from an opening match wrestler with potential to number 7 as a worker over a 1-year period is sort of unheard of. For Akira Taue, 1996 was a lucky number based on so many singles matches with great opponents. His 1997 number isn't so much an indication of a big decline as much as a reality check. Hiroyoshi Tenzan has been the most improved wrestler of the year when it comes to an unheralded improvement. If you don't believe it, check out a tape of the Yasuda match. But his tag team work doesn't hold up to his singles. The only real comments in regard to tag teams is just how pathetic the list is overall, and how the Steiners and LOD are living off their reputations, the latter more than the former. Japanese television rundown. December 13th, New Japan. 1. Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono beat Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto in 3:41 when Chono made Ohara submit to the STF. The match itself was terrible, actually a total squash win for Muto and Chono. Goto and Ohara were wearing t-shirts, and when the t-shirts were ripped off, they had the Japanese character for dog spray painted on their backs. After the squash, Muto and Chono gave Goto and Ohara NWO t-shirts and both put them on. They then all raised each other's hands up as if Goto and Ohara were officially accepted into the NWO. At that point, Goto and Ohara turned on Muto and Chono and left them laying, with Ohara delivering a series of choke slams. Actually, that aspect of the angle was great, but the crowd was even dead for that. Goto and Ohara then spray painted the character for dog on Muto and Chono. Finally, NWO Sting and Hiroyoshi Tenzan made the save. Dud. 2. Jushin Liger and Kendo Kashin and El Samurai beat Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa in 16:15. Again, about half the match aired on television, and it was the same excellent action they do week after week. The chemistry in this match is great because all 6 have their own unique style. Liger has the psychology and all his moves are over. Kashin does the submission style and UFC style within a framework of a New Japan style match. Samurai is a great underrated worker. Kanemoto has the cocky streak and has improved to where he's as good a junior heavyweight worker as there is, and Takaiwa has his power spots like his Death Valley driver and triple bombs that always get a pop. In addition, anyone can job at almost any time. This one ended with Liger pinning Kanemoto after a brainbuster off the top rope. After the match, to set up their junior heavyweight title match, Kashin locked Otani in the Jujigatama, another name for the cross armbreaker, armbar and Gracie armbar. 4 stars. 3. Shinya Hashimoto and Manabu Nakanishi beat NWO Sting and Tenzan in 13:35 when Hashimoto pinned Sting after a DDT. Bad for the most part except for Tenzan's willingness to take Hashimoto's brutal comeback kicks. Right now there is probably no better wrestler in the business when it comes to making the fiery hot babyface tag, which was the prototype of tag team matches of the past, than Hashimoto due to the believability of his kicks. 1.5 star. 4. Tatsumi Fujinami and Kengo Kimura beat Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki in 14:10. Decent match. Finish was good with Fujinami twice taking Sasaki down in small packages and Sasaki kicking out, then Kimura hitting Sasaki with a leg lariat and Fujinami taking him down with a third small package and getting the 3 count. A mild upset, particularly with champ Sasaki as the one doing the job. 1.75 stars. December 20th, New Japan. 1. Hashimoto and Nakanishi beat Sasaki and Yamazaki in the match to determine which team faced Muto and Chono in the Super Grade Tag Team Tournament Finals later in the show in 15:24. A great match with a lot of heat. Sasaki threw some really hard slaps at Nakanishi. A hot spot saw Yamazaki go for the armbar on powerhouse Nakanishi, who countered by flattening him with a side slam and then hit overhead belly-to-belly suplex. Later Nakanishi had Yamazaki up in the rack, and Yamazaki maneuvered from that position into an armbar for another great spot. Sasaki did a great job of selling his leg. Hashimoto came in for the hot tag and hit 3 DDTs, but Yamazaki kept saving Sasaki. Sasaki hit 3 lariats on Hashimoto but collapsed due to the leg injury before being able to get the pin. Another good spot saw Yamazaki try a Wakigatami, Fujiwara armbar, on Hashimoto, but couldn't take him down, and then Sasaki ran in and grabbed Hashimoto in a facebuster, taking him down and allowing Yamazaki to get full pressure on the hold. However, Nakanishi ended up saving him. Yamazaki continued to kick on Hashimoto's left arm to set up the Wakigatami, but Hashimoto blocked it, hit a few solid knees, ADT, and then took Yamazaki down with the Wakigatami for the submission. 3.75 stars. 2. Otani beat Ka Shin in 14-16 to retain the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. This was different from the usual New Japan Juniors match because Ka Shin does the UFC style as opposed to the high-flying style, but once again showed Otani's talent for being able to work a great match whether it be New Japan style, Lucha Libre style, American style, or shooting style. They did a good spot where they traded bridges out of pins until Ka Shin dropped Otani with a reverse DDT. Most of the match was built around Ka Shin doing cross-arm breakers and Otani selling like crazy before getting to the ropes. At one point Otani got a choke sleeper on but Ka Shin made the ropes and Otani refused to break. At another point Otani was on the top rope but Ka Shin took him down with a flying arm bar but Otani made the ropes. Otani hit his springboard spin kick for a near fall, springboard drop kick to the back and then went for his dragon suplex finisher but Ka Shin reversed it into another arm bar. This was the highlight of the match as Otani did an incredible sell job before finally making the ropes. The two were on the mat doing a ram butt spot before Ka Shin went for another armbar, but this time Otani reversed it into his dragon suplex finisher for a near fall, and then got the pin after a second dragon suplex. 4 stars. 3. Muto and Chono won the Super Grade Tag Tournament beating Hashimoto and Nakanishi in the finals in 23-33. Most of the match aired on television. Hashimoto had his left arm all taped up selling the injuries from Yamazaki's kicks and Wakigatamas in the previous match. This built into an excellent final with Muto and Chono having their working shoes on. Nakanishi was injured, the cameras missed this spot but you could hear an audience reaction and Nakanishi were nowhere to be seen for a few minutes. Hashimoto got a few near falls before Chono kicked him in the knee. Big pop when Hashimoto kicked out of Muto's moonsault. Chono used his Yakuza kick, Muto did a dragon screw in figure 4. At this point Nakanishi recovered, but Chono took him down and put him in the STF. Muto held Hashimoto in the figure 4 for a long period of time with Hashimoto selling and teasing a rope break before finally submitting. The finish was excellent and overall one of New Japan's best TV shows of the year. 4 stars. Mexico. Very little of major news as this is traditionally a slow time of the year in Mexico until February. Promo Azteca will be sending wrestlers on a tour of Honduras, Costa Rica, and Guatemala. Pierroth Jr., Jerry Estrada, El Texano and Villano III are leaving for Puerto Rico until February. Most of the same talent that drew the Big House on December 19th continued on working Juarez on December 21st which drew 12,000 fans. In the border cities, where the economy has some closer ties to the United States, tourist cities and families who live in the border city but have jobs across the border, the economic situation isn't as bad as in most of the country and in those cities pro wrestling is booming. AAA's big show in Madero a few weeks back drew 11,000 fans but we don't have any details on the results. Japan. Largely a slow week for news. Wars J1 tournament will conclude on January 14th at Korakuen Hall with Genichiro Tenryu vs Nobutaka Araya to crown its first heavyweight champion who will get Rikidozan's original Japanese heavyweight title belt from the mid-50s. Tenryu beat Koji Kiao on December 24th at Korakuen Hall to reach the finals. Osamu Nishimura will be joining the NWO. The storyline is that Masahiro Chono recruited him when both were in Germany working for Otto Wanz. As mentioned last week, Nishimura is a protege of Tatsumi Fujinami so that's part of the angle. Giant Baba returned from his annual Hawaiian vacation and held a press conference talking about his May 1st Tokyo Dome show. He told reporters that he was interested in using wrestlers from the WWF. The magazines are largely pushing the idea hard that it'll be a combined All Japan/WWF show, and asked the reporters to give him ideas on what matches would be the most attractive. At this point, there has been no direct dialogue between Baba and Vince McMahon nor any kind of a deal, although reporters from Japan spoke with WWF personnel about the Dome show several weeks ago. The WWF would be interested, although all the details such as financial terms, agreement on finishes, etc. would have to be worked out ahead of time. After the Dome, New Japan's first 2 tours of the year will be January 26th to February 15th with big shows on February 7th and February 8th in Sapporo and February 15th in Budokan Hall, and March 5th to March 25th with a major show on March 22nd in Nagoya. The G1 Climax tournament will be 5 nights, July 30th to August 3rd. After doing the job for Kiyoshi Tamura at the December 23rd Rings show in Fukuoka which drew 6,800, Akira Maeda said that Tamura would be the next big star in the promotion and again issued his own challenge to Hickson Gracie before he retires in September. It's quite a risk for any promotion, let alone a supposed shoot promotion, go with a 187-pound guy as its top babyface, although Tamura is the class worker in the company and has been used as the headliner on the last several shows to ease his way into the number one position. The Uemanosuke Ueda benefit show on December 23 at Korakuen Hall with the 13 different promotions involved drew 1,627 fans, which is almost full in the small building, but overall reports were that it was a poor show. The wrestlers all worked the show for free. Seiji Sakaguchi, Animal Hamaguchi, Antonio Inoki and Tarzan Goto all sat in the ring and they had a hookup with Ueda, who was in a hotel in his hometown of Kumamoto, thanking everyone. Ueda is basically an invalid due to an auto accident and couldn't even travel to Tokyo for the show. The team of 36-year-old Jaguar Yokota, the oldest women's wrestling champion in the history of Japanese wrestling, and 17-year-old Yuko Kosugi, won JD's tournament to crown the first TWF Tag Team Champions. It was a points deal ending on December 28 at Korakuen Hall. Going into the finals, Linus Asuka and Ryura were in first place with 10 points, Yokota and Kosugi had 9, Kyoko Inoue and Sumiko Sakai had 8, as did Kuga and Ryoga with 2 points for a win and 1 for a draw. Inoue and Sakai beat Asuka and Ryura, so both finished with 10. So in the final match, Yokota and Kosugi versus Kuga and Ryoga, if Yokota's team won, which they did, they won the belts. If it was a draw, it would cause a three-way match with Yokota's team, Asuka's team and Inoue's team. If Kuga's team won, it would cause a three-way match with them, Inoue's team and Asuka's team. They teased the 30 minutes draw by going 27-44 before Yokota's team won. Yokota also posed for a nude magazine photo spread which comes out next month, which makes her the oldest woman wrestler in Japan ever to do that as well. Kingdom is pushing the idea of a Tank Abbott vs Hiromitsu Kanehara UFC rules main event for January 28 at Korakuen Hall. They haven't officially announced the match but are already trying to publicly push the idea of it. JWP announced its awards for the year, naming Hikari Fukuoka as MVP and Fukuoka vs Cutty Suzuki on May 5 as the match of the year. Kiao and Nobukazu Hirai and Masaaki Mochizuki defend War's 6-man belts against Hiroshi and Nobutaka Araya and Lance Storm on January 13. It is believed Storm is going to be through with War either this tour or next and end up working full-time for ECW. War is doing a deal where Koki Kitahara has quit to become a free agent, but actually will form a tag team with Masao Orihara to feud with Tenryu and Araya on top. Abdullah the Butcher returns for the next tour. Zen runs its debut show on January 7 at Korakuen Hall, headlined by Atsushi Onita and Koji Nakagawa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda vs Yukihiro Kanemura and Mr. Ganasuke and Haido plus Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki vs Jado and Hiromichi Fuyuki. JWP sold out Korakuen Hall on December 26 for a combined show with AJW headlined by Mayumi Ozaki's supposed final match with the promotion. Ozaki pinned Dynamite Kansai on top. Ozaki will be working for all the women's promotions next year as a freelancer. Devil Masami and Cutie Suzuki went to a 30-minute draw with Manami Toyota and Fukuoka as well. Katsuhiko Nagata, the younger brother of WCW's Yuji Nagata, captured the All Japan National Greco-Roman Championship on December 23 in the tournament in Tokyo in the 211-pound weight class. Yuji Nagata was a national champion in Greco-Roman wrestling and Olympic Games hopeful. He was an alternate for the 1992 Olympics, before going into pro wrestling with New Japan. Gedo and Jado won the Big Japan tag titles from Ryushi Yamakawa and Yoshihiro Tajiri on December 22 in Isazaki on a Fuyuki Gun show. They'll be defending the title on the first Big Japan show of the next year on January 2 at Korakuen Hall. Mitsuhiro Matsunaga returns on that show, teaming with Shoji Nakamaki and Jason the Terrible vs Great Pogo and Shadow WX, Satoru Shiga, and Shadow Winger Takashi Okano, in a Falls Count Anywhere match. TV ratings saw New Japan on December 13 do a 3.5 rating and All Japan on December 14 did a 2.7 rating. Here and there. Question of the week. Who is the wealthiest active pro wrestler? Hulk Hogan. No more. The wealthiest is New Hampshire-based independent wrestler Jason Sanderson, who works for New England Ringside Wrestling as the Wolfman some nights and by day for Yankee Screen Printing. On December 17, Sanderson won $66 million in the New Hampshire lottery. The old USWA territory has turned into something of a hotbed of news outside the ring. The lawsuit between XL Sports Limited, the Mark Selker group of investors, and Jerry Lawler was filed in bankruptcy court, where the degree of proof is generally considered easier than a regular civil suit. XL Sports is suing Lawler to recover $1.11 million, the price they paid for their USWA purchase, and $300,000 in expenses claimed as a result of a fraudulent transfer. The dropping of the original suit and subsequent filing of bankruptcy appeared to be measures to get the suit into what would be an easier court to recover money, since the idea is no longer to gain control of the dead company, because all you would win was liability to pay owed money to television stations and arenas, and the most valuable asset the company actually had, the television deals, have all been lost, but to recover the money spent. The basic claim in the suit is that Lawler and Lawrence Bertman, Larry Burton, conspired, colluded, aided, and abetted one with the other and with others as yet not named as defendants to concoct a scheme and device by which to trick, cheat, and deceive debtor by lies, tricks, misrepresentations by material omissions, conversion, and other forms of theft designed to victimize persons later to become principals of and/or lenders, vendors, employees, and other creditors of and to debtor into delivering to Lawler and/or Bertman/Burton approximately $1,110,000. The suit itself has a lot of wording but no documentation to back it up, and not a lot of specifics as to what happened, other than the factual prices, that Lawler and Bertman bought Jerry Jarrett's 50% of the USWA for $187,000. The actual sale price would have been $262,000, but Bertman received $75,000 of that as a brokering fee for putting together the sale between Lawler and Jarrett, and immediately sold that 50% plus another 5% to XL Sports for $1,110,000. The suit claims Lawler and Bertman misrepresented to both sides aspects of the sale. The suit claims that the maximum value of the entire company, in which Lawler and Bertman sold 55% of, would be $500,000. The suit also claims Lawler and Bertman conspired to deplete the assets of the company, basically to run it down. It is rumored that the other person not named as defendants in the lawsuit is a very prominent current major wrestling official. Lawler has always maintained that he simply made a big profit on a transfer of stock, and that the Selkers had no idea how to run a wrestling company, and after buying it, immediately ran it into the ground. The only action involving the suit is that Lawler's attorney asked for a continuance until January. Bertman and Mike Samples and Jerry Faith of Kentuckiana Championship Wrestling had been working together in a small way, and Bertman, as Larry Burton, even appeared on the KCW television show introduced as the new general manager of the company, a figurehead Jack Tunney role. Bertman and Samples then had a falling out as Bertman is making noises of restarting a promotion along with Lawler and Elliot Pollock. Lawler and Brian Christopher have been working regular casino shows in the northern Mississippi area promoted by one of the Nunnery brothers, who are longtime friends with Lawler. Meanwhile, in Nashville, Burt Prentice ran his Music City Christmas show before 425 fans, which included a really sick match with Wolfie D and Flash Flanagan, described as very similar to the Sabu Sandman pay-per-view match, although a lot more bloody but not nearly as sloppy. Colorado Kid beat Frenchie Riviera, Keith Arden, in a hair match, and Riviera was shaved bald. Among those underneath were Rex King, Stephen Dunn, Jamie Dundee, Doug Gilbert, Dutch Mantle, Billy Travis, and Sir Mo. Music City is going to attempt to do a one-night deal in early 1998, and this is far from a done deal, to bring in Stan Lane and Steve Kieran, who were huge draws in the mid-'80s in the area as the Fabulous Ones, perhaps even bringing in Jim Cornette to work the show as a manager. Some notes on Auto One's biggest show of the year on December 20th in Bremen, Germany. The gimmick was that it was CWA versus the World in a series of matches. It opened with Tony St. Clair and Osamu Nishimura representing CWA beating Robbie Brookside and Rhino Richards, said to be representing WCW. Franz Schumann retained his CWA middleweight title beating Doug Gilbert, said to be representing the non-existent USWA Ice Train, said to be representing WCW. Beat Cannonball Grizzly of CWA via DQ. Masahiro Chono representing NWO, beat Christian Eckstein of CWA in what was said to be easily the best match on the show. Ulf Herman of CWA then beat Wayne Kreiderman, said to be representing the defunct Stampede Wrestling, and in the main event Marshall Duke Drosy, kept his CWA title pinning Savio Vega, WWF. After the match, since CWA had 4 wins and 2 losses, the promotion claimed it proved CWA was the best promotion in the world. The final match was a worked boxing match with Ludwig Borga aka Tony Halme beating Tony Richardson, billed as the Nigerian heavyweight boxing champion. How many of you remember the name Iron Mike Pappas? A small WWF jobber in the 70s and early 80s? Anyway, he appeared this past week on Wheel of Fortune, much heavier around the middle than in his wrestling days, but they say he was a former pro wrestler who had to get out in the early 80s because everyone was getting so big. Pappas was used several times as one of Hulk Hogan's early opponents in his first WWF run as a heel managed by Freddie Blassie. Since Pappas was something like 5'3", They'd use him as a jobber for the big heels to give the illusion they were even bigger than they were, as for years they tried to push Hogan as being 6'9" or 6'10". Carlos Colon worked a show at Gleason's Gym in Brooklyn on December 20th for Johnny Rod's World Unpredictable Wrestling. Mike Mooneyham of the Charleston Post-Courier ran a lengthy obit last week on Luke Brown, who died about a month back at the age of 62. Some notes on Brown: real name Carl Dennis Campbell Sr., who was 6'8" and 380 pounds, making him one of the largest men in wrestling during the 60s, where he and Grizzly Smith, the father of Jake Roberts, formed a hillbilly tag team called the Kentuckians. The article quoted Smith as saying the two met in 1960 and formed a tag team the next year in Oklahoma. Campbell played college football at Xavier before becoming a 400-pound taking on all-comers carnival wrestler in 1958. He was spotted at the carnivals by Frank Townsend, who brought him into pro wrestler as Man Mountain Campbell. He wrestled through 1976, retiring after a shoulder injury, although he worked in the Portland area in recent years as a referee. We incorrectly reported that he was the brother of Dutch Savage, a big-name wrestler/promoter in Oregon, but apparently that wasn't the case. The two were close friends, and Campbell helped break Savage into wrestling, and Savage delivered the eulogy at Campbell's funeral. The Village Voice in the December 30th issue ran a story on Kessler Raymond, better known as midget star Haiti Kid in the 70s and 80s. Stefan Hopp's Independent Wrestling World has a show on February 15th in Hanover, Germany, headlined by Sabu and Rob Van Dam versus Franz Schumann and Ulf Herman, and Dirt Bike Kid versus Mikey Whipwreck, along with a shoot fighting exhibition with Hubert Numrich. Schumann will be opening up his own promotion called the European Wrestling Alliance in June, and will be promoting a tour of Kenya in January using most of the CWA wrestlers. NHB. Only major result is that Nick Nutter of Hammer House went to Brazil and beat a fighter called Black Devil. During the match, Nutter, a top-notch amateur wrestler, tackled Devil and they fell through the ropes and broke a table. No word if the Brazilian started chanting ECW. ECW. The biggest news appears to be that ECW will be broadcast on pay-per-view by Time Warner starting with the March 1st pay-per-view, which most likely will be from the Dunn Center in Elizabeth, New Jersey. This adds about 3 million homes to the pay-per-view universe for ECW, which would make it available in about 85% of the homes that cleared WWF and WCW. Cablevision would be the lone major conglomerate still not carrying the shows. Since Time Warner is strong in New York City, where ECW is also strong, one would think this should add close to 10,000 new buys to ECW's total. Stevie Richards had the surgery this past week to remove 2 vertebrae from his neck, and from all accounts he'll never have the mobility necessary in the neck to wrestle again. ECW did lose its time slot on MSG Cable, which shuts them out of television in some outlying markets and out of anything but fringe time slots in New York. They still have clearance in New York on Channel 31 at 2 a.m. on Saturdays. Although no return date was announced at the building for Queens, the plan is to return in March. The weekend shows on December 26th in Queens, New York, and December 27th in Blackwood, New Jersey, both sold out to the tune of about 1,000 and 1,300 respectively, with them turning away several hundred in Queens. Great Sasuke worked both shows in the openers against Tiger Mask, and the crowd didn't get into it either night. The matches were said to have been okay, although Sasuke is noticeably slowed down from all his injuries. The fans, particularly in New York, really disrespected the wrestlers, according to our reports, chanting things like Hiroshima and Power Rangers and boring. In Queens, which was said to have been an angle-filled hot show with the best crowd heat ever in the building, which is high praise because it may be ECW's hottest arena right now, Jerry Lynn beat Chris Chetty in what was said to have been the best match of the weekend. Pablo Marks showed up and issued a challenge to anyone. Nicole Bass, a 6'2", 230-pound woman bodybuilder who achieved some level of notoriety in bodybuilding mags for her manly freakish physique about 6 years ago and got a lot of play on a few Howard Stern shows, showed up and powerbombed him. Bass is going to be linked with Jason and Just Incredible to try and do for them, basically get them over when their own talent on its own failed, what Chyna did for Helmsley. Her gimmick will be the sexiest woman on earth, and she'll be the love interest for Jason, the sexiest man on earth, trying to make it like Jason is gay, making out with a woman who looks more like a man than most men do. Credible then beat Tommy Dreamer due to outside interference from the Pit Bulls, working their final weekend. It seems we write that every weekend, although this time they were saying goodbyes to everyone in the dressing room with the group. Dreamer DDT'd both Pit Bulls, making his own comeback. Then New Jack and Spike Dudley did an interview. Well, actually New Jack, Spike was just there drooling. At first he did an interview running down Philadelphia fans and praising New York fans. Obviously this won't air on television. He then made reference to he and Spike dropping acid backstage before the match, and Spike said something to the effect of he was wanting more acid. Brackus then destroyed Paul Diamond and buried him under the WWF flag, and they said that it was Vince McMahon's message to Diamond belatedly that he was being fired. Taz and Brackus ended up having a stare down. Sabu and Rob Van Dam jumped him, but Dreamer and Sandman made the save for him. Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon then jumped Dreamer and Sandman until Al Snow, who got the biggest reaction of anyone both nights this weekend and may wind up as the top babyface in the promotion at this rate, made the save. Dreamer and Sandman and Snow demanded an 8-man tag, but Taz said he wouldn't tell them until match time if he'd team with them. Lance Storm and Chris Condito retained the tag titles in a 3-way dance over Axl Rotten and Balls Mahoney and the FBI. Dudley's beat Spike and New Jack. The most noteworthy event of that match was that New Jack brought a 4-foot bong, pot-smoking paraphernalia, first as a weapon, and then he and Spike acted like they were taking hits in the ring. John Cronus did a run-in at the end. Finally they did the 8-man tag with Taz working the match, ending with Snow pinning Furnas, and after the match Snow wound up in the balcony while the fans chanted head. A correction from last week. On the January 2nd and January 4th shows this week in Inkster, Michigan and Indianapolis, they aren't announcing 3-way dances for the title on top. In Blackwood, perhaps the highlight of all was Tommy Rich doing an interview acting like he was an out-of-touch drunk. He teamed with Tracy Smothers and Little Guido as the FBI, and claimed that they had just won the World 6-man titles from the Von Erichs in Dallas, and then talked about beating the Freebirds in Georgia, beating the Road Warriors and Paul Ellering, and even talked about having just lost his world title to Harley Race. Anyway, they lost to Axl and Balls and Dreamer, ending with the Pit Bulls attacking Dreamer but Dreamer DDTing both, making his own comeback. Nicole Bass powerbombed Wild Bill on the card, and threw him down wrong so he landed on his head and really could have been hurt. This immediately caused some backstage controversy about why she was doing spots when she hasn't been trained. She's supposed to start training this week but did this show with little or no training at all. The wrestlers got their checks over the weekend for the Hardcore Heaven pay-per-view, and there weren't the kind of grumblings over the payoffs as there were for Barely Legal. There were several fights in the stands in New York, and a woman did take off her top, which is kind of becoming the in thing at the New York shows. Reports are that Sandman is looking even worse in the ring than before. Sabu had his teeth wired together after the incident a few weeks back, but in failing to take time off, in the match in Tokyo against Sandman on December 22nd, he got nailed and the teeth were messed up once again. For January 10th at the ECW Arena, it appears they'll have men's Teo versus Gran Hamada from Michinoku Pro, Great Sasuke versus Just Incredible, which is supposed to result in making Credible an international star, and maybe Snow versus Van Dam. Bam Bam Bigelow will probably return next week. Tommy Rogers returns after minor neck surgery on January 10th. Dick Togo is headed in during February, while another Michinoku wrestler, not sure but maybe either Super Delphin or Grand Naniwa, is coming in late January. WCW. Davey Boy Smith officially agreed to a deal with WCW on either December 24th or December 25th after paying the WWF $150,000 to buy out the final 32 months of his original 5-year contract. He may debut for an interview or an angle on the January 8th Thunder show, although he probably won't be able to wrestle in the ring due to recovering from arthroscopic knee surgery for 2 or 3 weeks. He had the surgery on December 4th, and his recovery slowed by getting a staph infection which ended up in both legs. He began training on December 25th. When his knee was examined, they found he did have a torn anterior cruciate ligament along with the other damage, and he was told he needed reconstructive surgery, which would have meant 6 to 8 months on the shelf, but he decided against the surgery because he didn't want to be out of action for that long. The rest of the damage besides the ACL tear was repaired in the scope. The story we have from sources close to Smith is that he was on the phone with Vince McMahon and somehow the direction of the WWF television came up, and he, who is one of the bigger wrestling fans among the wrestlers since his son Harry, who is training to be a wrestler, is such a huge fan. Anyway, he apparently complained that the shows weren't suitable for his son to watch, and one thing led to another, and McMahon offered him the opportunity to negotiate with WCW for 10 days, and if he couldn't cut a deal, he could return to WWF. Supposedly 2 days later was when he got word about the $150,000 buyout before he could get permission to negotiate with WCW or Japan, which held up the official leaving by a few weeks. His leaving is largely due to knowing too much about the Hart Michaels situation, from being ready to do the run-in for the finish and seeing all the pretending that went down there, to seeing Michaels throw the belt down and almost shatter it in the dressing room as he went through the curtain because he was so mad about the finish, to being in the dressing room for the actual post-match conversation between Hart and Michaels where Michaels promised not to bring the belt to television the next night or to act as if he had won the match, and actually physically involved in the fight, and injuring his knee in the process, dragging Bret Hart and Shane McMahon off, to witnessing the hotel charade for the boys between Jack Lanza and Earl Hebner where Hebner, in front of an audience of a few wrestlers since there was so much heat on everyone involved in the double-cross that night in Montreal, was claiming to know nothing about the finish and that he was double-crossed as well. I don't know how much details we've gone into about that aspect of the story, but after Earl Hebner sprinted from the ring into the awaiting car driven by Dave to get to the hotel room so there were no problems involving him in the dressing room, when he was in the lobby later in the night with several wrestlers, he and Lanza had a discussion loud enough for the wrestlers to hear. In the discussion, Hebner claimed he had been double-crossed on the finish, that he had no idea why the bell rang, and that he was flying home and quitting the promotion. Lanza talked him into staying in front of an audience of wrestlers claiming that everyone knew he wasn't involved. After all that, he felt it would be impossible to trust anyone in decision-making power. WWF was pretty much aware of how vehement his feelings were, and it's most likely that had he stayed, he wouldn't have been given any kind of a push and thus would have been unhappy, and it was a situation bad for everyone. Rick Martel and Jim Neidhart were backstage at Nitro, so they should be debuting any week now. Nitro on December 29th from Baltimore, Maryland drew a sellout 12,196 fans, 11,040 paying $225,339, the largest WCW gate ever in Baltimore. The show was tons better and had far more crowd heat than the pay-per-view the night before. Coming off the rating the previous week, there was probably more emphasis on this show than any in a while, and be all rights, it should have done a record or near record rating. Due to Christmas, we don't have numbers at press time. However, coming the day after the biggest pay-per-view in company history and with Monday Night Football over, unless the show the week before did lasting damage, the rating should have been in the 4.5 to 5.0 range. Anything less can be attributed to the show the week before doing lingering damage. Bill Goldberg destroyed Glacier in 101 with a jackhammer. Bret Hart did an interview. He got a big reaction when he came out. When he cut a strong anti-NWO promo, he was booed heavily. When he cut his promo on Hogan, he was cheered. He did his best there was, best there is, best there ever will be, but kind of tempered it a little since he was still something of an outsider to WCW fans. Raven again didn't wrestle Chris Benoit, so Hammer took his place. They only went 154, which wasn't bad except for one embarrassing superplex spot where Hammer didn't get Benoit up and Benoit had to obviously kick himself up into position for the move. The Nest ran in, until McMichael made the save to reunite them as a tag team. You haven't lived until you've seen McMichael and Hammer do a post-match brawl. They are killing Benoit with this program, and teaming him with McMichael isn't exactly the recipe to adequately display his talents. Ric Flair came out and did an interview where he quoted something I said in a story about him, basically that taking everything into consideration he was the greatest wrestler of all time, for the Baltimore Sun. Ultimo Dragon won the Cruiserweight title from Eddie Guerrero in 126 with the Dragon Sleeper. The finish was great. I'd say the match was great, but all they had was a finish. This makes the January 4th Tokyo Dome match with Dragon vs. Shinjiro Otani as the battle of the two leading lighter weight division belts in the world. Bischoff and Hogan did an interview with Hogan challenging both Sting and Hart. He cut a real good promo to immediately elevate Hart to a level where he and Hogan will do huge box office. Bobby Heenan showed up and changed sides once again to broadcast Nitro. Diamond Dallas Page kept the U.S. title, beating Mortis in 350 with the Diamond Cutter. They need to do something with Mortis as he's got both size and talent. Booker T won the TV title from Disco Inferno in 655 with a Harlem Hangover, somersault leg drop off the top. Fans in Baltimore really hated Disco compared to other cities. Booker T deserves a break as a singles wrestler. Dillon came out, followed by Bischoff, to set up Hogan's Sting for later in the show. Kurt Hennig pinned Chris Jericho in 333 with a fisherman suplex. Jericho went nuts after losing, so I guess they're doing something to start a heel turn to put some focus on him. Scott Hall did an interview. I'll bet you can repeat the entire interview word for word. Lex Luger racked Marcus Bagwell in 305. It still wasn't good. Hogan vs. Sting ended the show. The Hogan-Sting match in Baltimore was a lot better and more heated than the one in DC. Hogan worked hard, but his offense still looked horrible. With both shows being hot, ratings were excellent. Nitro did a 4.6 rating, 4.7 first hour, 4.6 seconds hour, and 7.3 share. Raw did a 3.7 rating, 3.3 first hour, 4.0 seconds hour, and 5.8 share. This no doubt will encourage WCW to go 3 hours because they handed WWF a tremendous second hour rating when they went off the air. WCW Replay also did well, 2.0 rating and 3.7 share. Other weekend numbers saw Main Event at 1.4, Saturday Night at 2.2 and Pro at 1.0. Whatever ideas there were about doing all NWO house shows in 1998 appear to have been dropped in the wake of the ratings on December 22. Despite what you may hear or read, there had been no thought at all given to Bischoff beating Zbyszko since the decision was made to go with Bret Hart as ref. That decision was made about 5 days before the TV show in Charlotte. Speaking of Charlotte, as irony would have it, Hart and the Heckners bumped into each other at the airport. Reports are that Bret was cordial to Dave, but not to Earl. On December 22 before the Nitro show, Bischoff had a meeting with the wrestlers where he emphasized that he didn't want any low blows, lewd gestures or any kind of swearing on the show. He emphasized it was important to differentiate the product from the WWF's because of what he felt would be bad publicity and a potential sponsorship problem if both companies get painted with the same brush. However, Starrcade, Sting did crotch chop a la Hall, 6 and DX. Bischoff also made a point to say how Craig Leathers, Annette Yother and Kevin Sullivan had written a great television show. Alex Wright was among the WCW wrestlers in the crowd at the Starrcade. Reports are that he will be able to come back and wrestle, although he does have to be careful regarding certain moves. They were teasing that he would end up being managed by James Vandenberg. The George Michael Sports Machine syndicated show on a lot of NBC affiliates did a feature on sports highlights for 1997, and one of the clips was from the Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Eddie Guerrero match from Havoc, the springboard somersault into the Hurricane Rana on the floor. We didn't have the official numbers in last week's issue for the WCW Saturday night taping on December 16 in Gainesville, Georgia, which drew 1,494 paid, a sellout, and $13,090. The first show from that taping aired last week, and when it came to presenting good wrestling matches, it was the best Saturday night show in a long time. Actually, the wrestling blew away either the pay-per-view or Nitro between Malenko vs. Parka, Dragon vs. Psychosis, and especially Mysterio Jr. vs. Guerrero, all of which were short versions of very good to excellent matches. The benefit show for the Brian Pillman family put on by Diamond Dallas Page and Marcus Bagwell's mother in Marietta, Georgia, netted the Pillman family $1,500. WWF. There wasn't much wrestling 20 minutes in a 2-hour show, but the Raw on December 29 from the Nassau Coliseum was maybe the best Raw in a while. The show drew a sellout 11,243, paying $271,388. The gate would be an all-time record for a Raw taping, and featured all sorts of angles. It opened with Goldust dressed up as the New Year baby in a diaper with a large bottle doing his reading with the exaggerated stereotypical voice. Steve Austin came out and they dropped, clumsily I might add, an outhouse from the ceiling, and Austin put Goldust in it twice, turning it over the second time. So that was the way to get out of doing the match between the two that had been hyped on television all weekend. They started a show-long Mike Tyson tease, which at least came off as a pathetic ratings ploy because of how it was handled, and watching the crowd groan at the end of the show when they did the payoff. They kept teasing the name until at the end of the show saying that the WWF was entering into negotiations to get Tyson at Mania. Obviously correctly promoted, and the WWF would be expected to correctly promote it. A Tyson vs. Shamrock match could do huge box office, maybe bigger than any boxing match of 1998, let alone wrestling match, if they could convince people ahead of time that it would be a shoot. Even if it would, they'd have a hard time convincing anyone since it was a WWF show. But let's cut the speculating right here. It isn't going to happen. Tyson's people aren't going to risk putting him in a match that the odds are he'll lose very quickly. If he does a worked match with anyone, it will most likely piss off the athletic commissions and boxing people to where his indeterminate suspension from the sport he makes so much money for would be impossible to be rescinded. If he just shows up as a special guest to do a ref bit or a skit, unless he'll come in for a bargain price, his name isn't going to mean that much involved with pro wrestling to be worth millions on a pay-per-view, and it'll tarnish his image at a time where his PR people need to do everything to remove the tarnish he's already put on it and give WWF a lot of negative publicity in the process. They didn't even tease linking his name with Shamrock at all on TV. DOA beat Los Boricuas in a 6-man in 3:18 when Chains pinned Jose, who was the Boricua member who actually wasn't in the match. Helmsley showed up with his knee all bandaged up, claiming he'd dislocated his kneecap the day before in Hamilton, Ontario, and yes, he was supposed to drop the strap to Owen Hart on the show. Chyna had a boob job and the entire interview saw Triple H make breast jokes and Michaels drool all over her enhanced cleavage. Sergeant Slaughter came out with DX making fun of his belly, and he ordered Michaels to defend the WWF title against Hart in the main event. Shamrock beat Kama Mustafa with an ankle lock. After the match, The Rock came out and said that Shamrock would now have to face Farouk next week. Farouk looked majorly put about The Rock acting like he was in control and ordering him around. The Rock/Farouk stuff has great chemistry. Jerry Lawler and Brian Christopher beat Taka Michinoku and George Steele, 60 years old, via DQ. Steele did his eating the turnbuckle gag, which got a big reaction. He was horrible in the ring, but he always was. It was a decent 2 minutes of comedy, but it got scary when they hinted of a Lawler vs. Steele program. Dude Love did an interview where he transformed into Mankind and then Cactus Jack. Real interesting in New York to see zero reaction to Dude Love, and a huge pop when he switched to Cactus Jack. Jack ended up fighting both New Age Outlaws, winding up in a short singles match with Road Dogg ending in a DQ when Billy Gunn interfered, and he dragged them to the back where there was a big box. As they fought, a chainsaw was sawing his way out of the box. There was a chant of Terry almost immediately because it had been not exactly a secret. Funk was debuting on the show. Funk came out wearing a stocking and was called Chainsaw Charlie, and the announcers never used the name Terry Funk. He chased the Outlaws around with a chainsaw, basically doing the Leatherface gimmick from Japan. Sable came out pushing the swimsuit issue of the Raw magazine, and Mark Marrow came out and did his promo on her. Marrow then gave announcer Kevin Kelly a low blow until Tom Brandi made the save. Marrow laid him out with a TKO on a chair and stuffed photos of Sable from the magazine into his mouth and trunks. Marrow really pushed hard to the fans the idea of bringing the magazine photos and posters to arenas, as he told everyone specifically not to do it. Considering just how flat Marrow was when he returned, it's a real credit to the booking coming up with this idea that's getting him over. DOA, Flash Funk, Scott Taylor and Headbangers were in the ring to destroy Kane. Undertaker made the save fighting side by side with Kane until they cleared the ring and had another stare down. Undertaker walked away. There were noticeable boos for Undertaker walking away. It has not gone unnoticed internally that Kane is getting over more as a babyface. Anyone can see the eventual plan is for them to team, but not until they feud first. Jim Cornette did an interview to set up his traditional wrestling to do an interpromotional feud with the WWF. He did a tremendous delivery and cut a great promo. There is some truth as far as it being his personal beliefs to most of what he said. I believe the idea actually came because Cornette was complaining so much about the current direction internally that they decided to make an angle out of it. Finally, Hart beat Michaels via DQ in 10-12 when Hart had Michaels in the sharpshooter and Triple H clocked him with the crutch. Of course, Helmsley whiffed on the first crutch shot and had to do it again. 3 1/2 stars match. They made a point to mention Earl Hebner was the ref, although he played no part in the match. TV tapings on December 30th in New Haven drew another sellout. It was largely a dead crowd, and I'm told there is going to have to be some sweetening of the sound before it hits the air on January 5th. In a dark match, Paul Roma returned, managed by Mr. Ruby, a guy described as being slightly larger than Harvey Whippleman, beating Nick Barbary with a power slam. Roma was doing a Rick Martel pretty boy type gimmick and he didn't look good. For Shotgun, Rock beat Chains with the other Nation of Domination and DOA at ringside. Mosh beat Phineas Godwin via DQ when Henry interfered, whipping Mosh with a belt. Steve Blackman beat Barbary in a match with no heat. Blackman does a nunchaku gimmick before the match. People don't know him to react to him yet. Jackal beat Scott Taylor when Kurgan interfered. The new idea seems to be to get Kurgan over by destroying people on run-ins and avoiding putting him in the ring to wrestle. Mark Henry beer-hugged Roy Raymond. Takamichi Inoku beat Pablo Marquez in a 2 1/4 stars match in 5:25. Marquez was brought out by Christopher, but after the match Christopher turned on Marquez for losing. Alex and Paul Roma. Alex, I believe, is a cousin who was described as being really green, debuted as the Primo Pretty Boys doing and beating Brian Walsh and Ross Greenberg. They didn't look good. Raw opened with Austin saying he was going to be there a lot during the show. It started with Shamrock versus Farouk. Rock told Kama and D'Lo to interfere, but Kama and D'Lo acted as if they didn't know what to do. Finally, Kama held up a chair, but Shamrock reversed the whip and Farouk hit the chair, got hit with the belly-to-belly and ankle lock. Farouk started yelling at Kama about why he did it and they left. At this point, Rock and Shamrock started arguing when Austin came out of the crowd and gave both stunners and left through the crowd. Shamrock acted really mad about it. Cornette came out with Dennis Coralluzzo and Howard Brody as the president and vice president of the NWA, the oldest wrestling organization in the world, and mentioned it was the organization of great champions like Luthez and Harley Race. They then had a match to crown the NWA North American Champion with Jarrett going against Barry Windham. Not billed as a blackjack but still with the black hair and mustache, and billed as a former NWA World Heavyweight Champion. The idea they were going back to tradition and wrestling was blown because the match was terrible, with Jarrett mainly clowning around rather than wrestling. As Windham set up a superplex, Corluzzo distracted the ref and Cornette hit Windham with his tennis racket and Jarrett was crowned the champion. They did a presentation in the ring with Cornette, Brody, Corluzzo and Jarrett when Austin came out again. The first three got out of the ring but Jarrett didn't see him coming and got the stunner. No word if Dan Severn does sign, as is expected, if he'll be part of the angle as NWA World Champion. Would make sense because you could sell him as a traditional style real wrestler without a gimmick, but in the other sense WWF may not want another world champion on its show than their own. For example, in 1987 when Jim Crockett bought out Bill Watts, there was a lot of heat among the NWA wrestlers over them calling the UWF title a world title, which they did, but in the booking scheme of things it was downgraded so much that nobody took it as a title, and they never even did the eventual unification match, just simply dropped the title. Shamrock did an interview challenging Austin to meet him at the Rumble. Skull and 8-Ball beat Recon and Sniper, but after the match Kurgan laid out one of them with a claw. Triple H, a wheelchair, did an interview with Michaels, who didn't talk, and China, mainly doing breast jokes about China. Owen Hart beat Savio Vega. Hart got surprisingly little reaction. The finish seemed weird as well as Vega didn't tap from the Scorpion, but then lost to a roll-up. After the bout all four Breakwaz destroyed Owen and brought him to Triple H, who slapped him around from his wheelchair. Bearer did an interview saying he hated Undertaker and that after last week, Kane had disappeared and he couldn't find him anywhere and begged for Kane to come back. Probably we won't see Kane until the Rumble. Mero beat Brandy via DQ in 5:20. Sable did a worked leg injury and was helped to the back and Brandy was concerned, ended up being caught from behind and given the TKO. Before Mero could pin him, Austin came out of the crowd and gave Mero a stunner. Goldust came dressed up like a black pimp for a match against Flash Funk. Of course Luna was dressed like a pro. No, not a pro wrestler. Funk was allowed to show his stuff and was said to be the best wrestler on the entire show. As he was on the top rope, Luna pushed him off for a DQ. Goldust beat him up after until Vader made the save. Vader then hugged Funk. No doubt they'll play up that Vader was the one who actually got Charlie Skaggs started in pro wrestling with New Japan and also got him into WCW for his first American career break. Outlaws beat Headbangers. After the match Cactus and Chainsaw came out. Cactus did an interview introducing himself to WWF fans, saying he's going to bring blood and barbed wire into the WWF in 1998 and said that Chainsaw, Chance of Terry all over the place, was one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, his childhood hero and his toughest opponent of his career. Chainsaw then did a Terry Funk style promo. Finally Michaels was in the ring to challenge Taker. They had a casket brought to the ring and Michaels acted like Triple H and Chyna were in there as a rib. Then he saw them on the ramp and really mockingly in a way to kill the angle said, so who could be in there? Of course he opened it, Taker came out, the lights went off, and when they were on Taker was in the ring with the belt and Michaels was nowhere to be seen. Taker then dropped the title belt on the casket and left. Triple H and Chyna lifted up the lid of the casket and Michaels came out all shaken up, then as he was leaving, mooned the crowd for about 30 seconds, which may or may not make the airwaves. Dark main event saw Austin and Cactus and Chainsaw and Taker over Nation of Domination. Crush was officially given his release as well. He was legitimately injured in the Kane deal as Kane accidentally dropped him wrong. He ended up really upset over the situation to management and told some people off that pretty much paved the way to the end of his tenure. Chains is going to end up getting a singles push while Skull and 8-Ball are going to become a regular tag team. Despite all kinds of rumors to the contrary, there have been no discussions with Sid Aoki since he was told he was going to be released. Titan has made no inquiries about bringing him back. Aoki has told friends that when he's able to return to wrestling, he has no intention of working for the WWF as he's bitter about the situations leading to his dismissal. This is wrestling, so never say never, just that there is nothing to any of the rumors about him coming in or him being considered to come in as part of the DX pay-per-view show. The plan is for Dude Love to work most of the house shows, allowing him to do a less taxing nightly working style doing mostly comedy. On big shows after angles where Dude gets beaten up on TV, they'll unveil Cactus and when he's Cactus he'll do his more physically taxing style. The basic idea is to get a few Cactus Jack style matches per year, but not destroy his body to the point his career is shortened any more than the damage he's already done to himself will shorten it. Michaels vs. Hart will headline house shows in February in Toronto and Vancouver. Weekend house shows saw December 26th in Milwaukee, Aft, draw $5,293 and $95,343. December 26th, Eve, in Chicago drew a sellout $16,620 and $275,014. December 27th in Worcester drew $4,057 and $73,503. And December 28th in Hamilton, Ontario drew $6,469 and $120,836. Chicago merchandise was $146,000. The post-Christmas shows due to kids getting wrestling tickets for Christmas are traditionally the easiest shows of the year to draw. Obviously Chicago was a huge success, as were the TV tapings in Nassau Coliseum and New Haven. Milwaukee and Worcester would be decent but nothing more than decent. And Hamilton, although the numbers look good on paper, is far less than WWF usually does in that market, and considering it was Christmas week, the crowd was only half of what would be expected, which is the first post-Bret Hart leaving. There were a few shows after Survivor Series, but those tickets were basically all sold before Montreal, major market Canadian show. Not that I expect WWF not to be able to draw in Canada over the long haul, but for that specific show it was a huge difference. There were no reported problems from DX at the shows, although as part of their act they mooned the fans at the end of their match. In Chicago, where Michaels worked with Undertaker, run-in DQ finish, Michaels was nailed with a coat before the match, and over the house Mike said that he wasn't going to wrestle until the fan who threw it was kicked out, which he was. Philadelphia on January 25th has Shamrock and Hart vs. Michaels and Triple H, Austin and Dude vs. Rock and Farouk, Vader vs. Kane, Outlaws defending against LOD, Chains vs. Goldust, Bangers vs. Godwins, Taka defending against Christopher, Skull and 8-Ball vs. Vega, and Perez and Mero vs. Brandy. The January 3rd show in Corpus Christi, 4,000 capacity, sold out on December 19th. January 10th Madison Square Garden has 8,000 tickets sold for $221,000, and Royal Rumble in San Jose is now at 11,592 tickets and $326,581. Weekend ratings saw Live Wire at 1.3 and Superstars at 1.8. The readers' pages. Double cross. I want to add my name to the list of people praising your coverage of the last days of Bret Hart in the WWF. I've been getting the Observer since 1989, and I thought it was the best work of yours that I've ever read. I've been very surprised at the letters supporting Vince McMahon and critical of Bret Hart. I was glad to see you set the issues straight. True, the wrestling business is built on lies, both big and small. But to take Hart to task for being a loyal employee who wanted to go out with his head held high is cloudy thinking. I think many of your letters' writers are having trouble distinguishing between truth and wrestling fiction. Wrestlers are real people with real aches and pains. Lonnie McLeod, New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. ECW. I'd have to say it's been a pretty damn good year for Observer readers, from the Von Erich issue and the Brian Pillman issue ending with a major double cross that will live in wrestling infamy forever. You've handled each story admirably, but give us a break every once in a while with those run-on sentences. I went to the ECW show in Buffalo on December 13th with 3 longtime friends, each one of us wrestling junkies from way back. In a way, ECW reminded us a lot of the wrestling we saw as kids. Lots of brawling, bleached blonde hair and blood. This was in a small arena and there were no more than 1,000 fans, with about 10% being women. Everyone appeared that was advertised except for Shane Douglas and Bam Bam Bigelow. They didn't announce it, but if you watched the TV that day you would know. Sabu and Sandman's ladder brawl was pretty outlandish. It was just a series of spots without any story. Sandman did a variation of the Cactus Jack off the apron running elbow by turning it into a leg drop with Sabu over the railing. The somersault off the ladder through Sabu and a table was cool too. The finish with an Arabian facebuster on the ladder was classic. They didn't seem particularly sloppy, unless I was too caught up in the energy of it all. New Jack brought out the garbage can and his funky guitar playing had people yelping with delight. This was the only match that had blood. The crowd was totally under control. There were no fights. Just a lot of very vocal and very funny wrestling fans. Since this is the first time I've seen ECW live, I can't really say, but this show seemed to be toned down, but the fans seemed to be okay with it and everyone had a real good time. It was obvious that Tommy Dreamer, Sabu and Sandman were working with injuries so that they wouldn't let the fans down. Fans didn't grumble while leaving, and a fan who came in from Australia just to see wrestling told me that the show the night before in Jamestown wasn't as good. I hope these guys are saving their money because they aren't going to be able to do this as long as people like Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan. Although that doesn't explain Terry Funk. Dan Love Vronsky. Toronto, Ontario. WWF. Was I hallucinating, or did Vince McMahon really go on television this week and explain the WWF booking policy? I suppose comparing the WWF to Seinfeld could be considered apt since they both crashed and burned in 1997. I think if he's going to compare the WWF to other media, the more apt reference would be to David Lynch. I'm not expecting Dennis Hopper, in his role as Frank from Blue Velvet, to show up on Raw with his tank of laughing gas any day now. That wouldn't be any more surreal than what they are doing. The laughing gas would also explain some of the booking decisions. How bad is it when the WWF's programming is considered questionable by the standards of the USA Network? That's like Jim Morrison telling you that you party too much. And what does it say about me that I like the new WWF direction? I'll say this much for the show. It's not boring. That's more than I can say for Nitro. Adam Dolan, Stamford, Connecticut. Regarding the WWF's December 12th show in Chattanooga, I was unable to attend the show, but I do know the WWF received some pretty good publicity leading into the show. The lifestyle section of the Chattanooga Times featured a puff piece on the event written by Lisa Denton. The article had a photo of The Undertaker. Most of the local TV stations at least mentioned the event during the evening newscasts. WTVC, the ABC affiliate, was at the show for their 5:30 newscast, usually geared more toward soft news. The anchors interviewed Scott Taylor and the Headbangers. Then, in a moment that likely thrilled WWF being compare, the station segued into part of a package from several months ago when one of the anchors, Calvin Sneed, a ham reminiscent of Dusty Rhodes during the Crockett years, went to the WCW power plant. The Sunday newspaper, 2 days after the event, featured a big article which included some of the history of Chattanooga wrestling. I have yet to see the article, but I understand it mentions the Medics, Jerry Lawler, Sam Bass, Jackie Fargo, Tojo Yamamoto, and other stars from the Harry Thornton and Nick Have You Met My Son George Gula's era. I appreciate your work on the Bret Hart story. I found it to be incredibly engrossing. I also appreciate your remarks concerning the news on the internet. Most of what is on the net is junk, or a few people bright enough to call your hotline and one of the other few quality hotlines and then report their news and take credit as if they actually know all the inside information. I can't add much more to what's been said about your obituaries. As others have mentioned, it is part of why so many continue to support The Observer. There are those of us who enjoy the history of wrestling. Your knowledge and your sources provide those of us not privy to such info with further insight into this business that, unless shared, may eventually be forgotten. I may go to Nitro at the Georgia Dome. You can't miss me. I'll be the one holding up the sign. Tim Dills, Chattanooga, Tennessee. Vince McMahon must be choking on his decision to build the company once again around Shawn Michaels. The effects of Michaels' actions and influence is coming out at a rapid pace. He may have blown Memphis and Little Rock for the WWF based on his decision to walk out of those matches. I'll bet he's going to whine about it being an unsafe working environment. That unsafe situation was caused by his stupidity and not from heat generated during a match. People like Jim Cornette and many others survived and worked under far more dangerous situations like this in the Mid-South. Their heat was based on doing their job correctly, and not by being an asshole. Michael's decision to not do any time-honored traditions is going to influence others. We've already seen Steve Austin not put over Rocky Maivia. I can't wait to see how McMahon gets the belt off people like Michaels and others who have learned from his example. At least Bret Hart and Ric Flair did the right things for business when it came to dropping titles. Unfortunately, McMahon didn't do the logical decision in keeping Hart. His decision in screwing the entire family backfired already. Vince didn't screw Bret. Vince screwed Vince. He ended up losing stars who could draw not only in the United States but also in Canada and England. He had to give Owen Hart a raise to appease him. Don't forget to add Memphis and Little Rock that Michaels may have blown for him already. Plus, you now have to deal with a situation where no planning can be done too far ahead based on the fact that nobody is willing to do jobs. The ultimate loser in the long run is McMahon. I disagree with Andrew Stowell's letter in the December 15th issue in which he commented on Hayabusa's wrestling skills being a joke. I've seen Hayabusa work many 4-star matches that had good psychology and transitions. It's kind of hard to have that kind of a match with most of the workers in FMW since their style is similar to ECW and used brawling, high spots and blood to camouflage average to below average work and a lack of psychology. There aren't many workers in FMW that you can compare with the All Japan wrestlers in the ring. Hayabusa was only able to have actual wrestling matches with the Gladiator, Yukihiro Kanemura and a few others. There are not too many wrestlers who can look decent against garbage workers like Mr. Ganasuke, Mr. Pogo and Hisakatsu Oya. Don't get me wrong. I've seen Hayabusa against Great Sasuke, Sabu, and Jinsei Shinzaki. Those matches all sucked. They had no psychology and told no story. They just revolved around setting up and performing high spots. They resembled an exhibition of suicidal moves or your standard Cebu match. But now Hayabusa is given the opportunity to evolve in a wrestler with All Japan. Give him time to learn how to perform a match that deals with the confines of the ring, and he might be All Japan's answer to the New Japan Junior Heavyweight division. Eric Bimbin. Brooklyn, New York. Thursday show. The main reason I'm writing is to voice my opinion on the new Thunder show. Most people probably have one of two viewpoints. The first is that it will be good to separate NWO and WCW. It's risky, but it could be interesting. The second view is that this is oversaturation, which could lead to the downfall of WCW, or more importantly, pro wrestling in this country in general. My view is a little different. I don't like the idea because TBS is unavailable in my area. It's a little surprising because my cable system is Time Warner. For years I've felt like I've been missing half the WCW storylines, between not seeing WCW Saturday night and not getting to see the clashes. I seem to miss something when Nitro comes around. Part of WCW's problem is the fact they do such a poor job of keeping the fans updated on all the storylines and angles. Say what you want to about the WWF, they don't have that problem at all. Sure, they have a slim talent roster. Yes, McMahon is making a huge mistake by attempting to go into a more hardcore direction. But at least you always know what's going on. Matthew Young-Fran. Loch Sheldrake, New York. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228. January 5, 1998.